The sun had been a white fire for 4 straight months. It bleached the sky, scoured the land, and baked the very memory of color from the high desert. At Piñon Bluff, the grama grass had long since surrendered, crackling under Jonah Pike's boots, not like straw, but like old glass, shattering into yellow dust. The air was too thin to hold the heat, and too hot to hold any hope of rain. He was down to 3 head, 3 skeletal longhorns, their ribs showing like the hoops of a rotting barrel, their hides drawn tight over hip bones that jutted out like axe handles. They huddled in the sliver of shade cast by the canyon wall, too weak to browse, their tongues thick. The 4th, a calf born in the heart of the drought, lay by the dry creek bed. Its breathing was a shallow, papery rattle. Jonah knelt by the calf, his hand on its heaving flank. He'd seen death. He'd dealt it with his rifle and seen it come for men in the saloons of Copper Vale. But this slow, thirsty surrender, it felt like a personal failure. He'd tried. He'd hauled water 2 miles from the sluggish trickle of the Thunderwash, what little seeped past Silas Dorn's dam. He'd dug for seeps until his hands were raw, but the land was sealed tight, tucked inside his father's worn Bible, nestled between the lamentations of Jeremiah and the flyleaf where his mother had written his name, was the notice from the Copper Vale Bank. It was polite, official paper, but its message was as brutal as a shovel to the face. 21 days. He had 21 days until Piñon Bluff the Rocky. Unforgiving spread his father had broken himself to claim was seized for foreclosure. 21 days. He'd counted them this morning. 21 more sunrises before he was nothing but a vagrant with a saddle and a name nobody cared about. That evening, he rode his last horse a tired bay with a listless tail into Copper Vale. The town was huddled in the purple shadow of the mesas, but the heat hadn't broken. It radiated from the adobe walls and the dusty street. He didn't go to the bank. There was no point. He didn't go to the general store. His credit was as dry as his well. He went to the Juniper Bell. The saloon was the town's beating, a rhythmic heart. It smelled of stale beer, sweat, cheap tobacco, and the thick, cloying odor of desperation. Men drank not for pleasure, but to dull the edges of the day. A piano player in the corner listlessly plucked at a tune, the notes sour and thin. Jonah didn't come to drink. He came because this was the only place left. He stood just inside the batwing doors, letting his eyes adjust to the amber gloom. And in the back corner, holding court at his usual table, was Silas Dorn. Dorn was not a big man, but he filled a space larger than his body. His waistcoat was silk, stretched tight over a prosperous belly. A gold watch chain looped across it. He was a man who'd built an empire not on cattle or crops, but on the failures of other men. He owned the banknote in Jonah's Bible. He owned the dam at Sage Notch that choked the Thunderwash to a trickle. He owned, in one way or another, half the souls in this room. He saw Jonah. Of course he saw him. Dorn saw everything. He let Jonah stand there for a full minute, a man drowning in plain sight, before he gestured with a cigar. Jonah walked over, his spurs whispering on the sawdust floor. He felt the eyes of the other rancher's men he'd known his whole life, men he'd helped brand and build with turn on him. He felt like a bug under a glass. "Pike," Dorn said. His voice was smooth, almost friendly. "Come for a drink, or perhaps—" He tapped a sheaf of papers by his elbow. An extension. Jonah's throat was tight. "You know why I'm here. Dorn, the drought. I just need 1 season, a good rain. I can—" "Hope is a fine breakfast." "Jonah," Dorn interrupted, "but a poor supper." He leaned back, exhaling a plume of blue smoke that hung in the still air. He looked around the room, ensuring he had his audience. "You have nothing to bargain with. Your cattle are ghosts. Your land is thirsty dust. The bank," he smiled, "is not a charitable institution." Jonah's hand tightened on the brim of his hat. The humiliation was a physical thing, hot and coiling in his gut. "However," Dorn said, tapping the ash from his cigar, I find myself in a generous mood. And I have a problem of my own. A ward. You see, I have a responsibility to see her settled." Dorn paused, savoring the moment. The saloon had gone quiet. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. The only sound was the buzzing of a fly against the dirty window. "Here is my proposition," Dorn said, his voice dropping, but carrying in the sudden vacuum. "A simple transaction. You marry my ward, Elowen Hart, tonight in exchange. I will give you title to the Bluebell heifer out back. She's pregnant, due in a month, and I will grant a one-season stay on your note." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy. Men stopped breathing. Jonah's gaze followed Dorn's pointed finger. She was in the corner, near the back stairs, as if she'd been placed there for retrieval. She was a large woman, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a plain, functional brown dress that was laced tight but did nothing to hide the solid reality of her. She held an old, faded tapestry bag on her lap with both hands, holding it like an anchor in a storm. This was Elowen Hart. Jonah had seen her in town, always on the periphery, always with Dorn or his lawyer. A shadow. The town whispered, but no one knew her story, only that Dorn was her guardian. Jonah Pike was a proud man. His father had raised him to believe a man's name was his only true holding. And here, in a room full of his peers, Silas Dorn was asking him to sell it, to trade his name, his freedom, his life. For a cow in a few months' time. He felt his honor being weighed like a sack of feed, and the weight of it was crushing him. He wanted to spit in Dorn's face. He wanted to overturn the table, to tell him and the bank and the white-hot sky to go to hell. And then, through the open back door of the saloon, he heard it, a low, gentle moo. He turned his head. Tied to the rail behind the juniper bell, he could just see the flank of a fine, healthy, blue-roan heifer, Bluebell. She was heavy with calf, her hide sleek. She was a picture of life, of water, of milk. The scent of milk. He could almost smell it. Thick, creamy milk for the dying calf. Milk that could be churned to butter. Butter that could be sold. A calf that could be raised. A future. It was a single, stark image, and it cut through his pride like a hot knife. His anger didn't vanish, but it was overwhelmed by the crushing, brutal practicality of survival. Pinyon Bluff was dying. He was dying. His pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He looked back at his neighbors. Hal Jessup, who'd helped him dig his well, was suddenly fascinated by a spot on the bar. Old Man Hemlock, who'd drunk Jonah's father's whiskey, stared deep into his empty glass. They all looked away. They wouldn't meet his eye. In this, he was alone. This was the frontier. It gave no quarter and asked for none. Everyone paid a price to stay. Some paid in blood, some in sweat. Jonah Pike, it seemed, would pay in shame. He turned his gaze back to the woman. Elowen Hart. She was not looking at the floor. She was not crying, or pleading, or showing any sign of fear. She was looking directly at him. Her eyes were calm, her expression unreadable. It was the most unnerving thing in the room. She was being sold just as surely as he was, yet her gaze was steady. He saw her hands, clasped on the bag. They weren't soft. They were red and calloused, the knuckles pronounced. They were the hands of someone who had worked, and worked hard. They were hands like his own. That one detail, the sight of her hands, settled it. This was not some fragile, weeping doll. This was a woman who knew what hardtack tasted like. "Reverend," Dorn called out, snapping his fingers. Reverend Tolliver, who had been nursing a small bier near the front, started. He looked pained, his face pale, but he nodded. He was a weak man, his church roof repaired by Dorn's generosity last spring. He stood and moved toward the bar. "Merritt," Dorn said. The weasel-thin man beside him, his lawyer, Merritt Vale, already had the papers out. A marriage certificate. He smoothed it on the bar, right next to a damp ring from a beer mug. Dorn smiled, a wide, triumphant grin that showed a flash of gold on his back molar. He looked at Jonah. "Well, Mr. Pike, do we have an accord?" Jonah's voice, when it came, was a dry rasp. He didn't look at Dorn. He looked at the paper. "I do." The words hung in the air, a terrible mockery of a vow. Dorn laughed, a short, satisfied bark. He slapped Merritt Vale on the back. "Get the ink." Vale pushed an inkwell and a scratchy nib pen across the bar. Jonah Pike stepped forward. He picked up the pen. His hand was perfectly steady. He dipped it, the black ink clinging to the metal. He saw the line waiting for his name. He signed. The pen nib caught on the rough fiber of the paper. It made a small, ripping sound, like a tiny saw cutting through wet wood. It was the sound of his old life tearing apart. Jonah Pike. He set the pen down. "And the bride," Merritt Vale said, his voice slick. Elowen Hart stood. She walked to the bar, her steps measured, not hurried. She did not look at Jonah. She did not look at Dorn. She took the pen, dipped it, and signed her name below his Elowen Hart. Her handwriting was clear and strong. Witnessed Dorn boomed, signing with a flourish. Reverend Tolliver hurried to add his own shaky signature. "It is done," the Reverend said, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't quite bring himself to say, "I now pronounce you." Dorn tossed a small, heavy coin purse to the bartender. "A round for everyone." To the happy couple. The laughter was forced. The murmur of conversation returned. But it was strained. People began to finish their drinks quickly, suddenly eager to be elsewhere. The spectacle was over. Jonah stood frozen for a moment. He was a married man. "Your heifer is outside." "Pike," Dorn said, dismissing him. "And Mr. Vale will file the stay with the bank in the morning. A season. See that you use it wisely." Jonah nodded, unable to speak. He turned to leave. "Husband," a low voice said. He stopped. Elowen Hart. Elowen Pike was beside him, holding her tapestry bag. Her unreadable eyes were fixed on him. Without another word, the two of them walked out of the Juniper Bell. They stepped out of the amber light and into the darkness of the street. The night air was no relief. A hot wind had picked up, swirling down the main street. It carried no scent of rain, no promise of change. It carried only the smell of fine, choking dust and a cold, sharp odor of menace. The deal was done, but the payment had only just begun. The walk from the Juniper Bell to the Mesa Laurel Chapel took less than 5 minutes, but it felt to Jonah like the long, slow march from a gallows cell to the scaffold. There was no procession. There was only the sound of their boots on the hard-pan street, echoing in the alleyways. Silas Dorn led the way, his silk waistcoat a pale blotch in the moonlight. Merritt Vale, carrying a leather satchel, walked beside him. Jonah walked next, his shoulders hunched, and beside him, her steps matching his in a steady, unsettling rhythm, was Elowen Hart. Behind them, close enough for their boot heels to be a threat, were Dorn's men, Breck Sloan, thick-shouldered and smelling of gun oil, and a tall, gaunt man known only as Lanky Pete, whose eyes never seemed to blink. They were the honor guard. They were the punctuation on the contract. The Mesa Laurel Chapel was not a place of comfort. It was a small, narrow, clapboard building, its white paint long since peeled by the sun and grit, leaving it a sad, splintered gray. It smelled of dust, dry rot, and the faint, musky scent of bats in the belfry. A single oil lamp burned at the altar, casting long, trembling shadows that danced like specters on the walls. Reverend Tolliver was waiting, his face glistening with a nervous sweat despite the cooling night air. His wife, a woman as faded as the chapel paint, sat at the small pump organ, her hands clenched in her lap. "Let us begin," Tolliver stammered, fumbling with his prayer book. He opened it, his hands shaking so badly the pages fluttered. He found the service for marriage and began to read, his voice thin and reedy. He skipped whole sections, rushing the words together as if hoping to get the ordeal over with before God took notice. Dorn, Vale, Sloane, and Pete stood in the first pew, a solid, unmoving line of witnesses. They did not remove their hats. When it came time for the ring, Dorn produced a small, silver band from his waistcoat pocket. It was plain, unadorned, and looked old. He handed it not to Jonah, but to Elowen. "Put it on," Dorn ordered, his voice quiet but echoing in the small space. Elowen took the ring. She looked at it for a moment, her face impassive in the lamplight. She held up her left hand, her strong, calloused, working hand, and pushed the ring onto her fourth finger. It was too small. Jonah watched, transfixed. The silver band stopped at her knuckle. Elowen's expression did not change. She set her jaw, took a sharp breath, and shoved. She pushed the ring with her other thumb, her whole body tensing with the effort. The metal scraped, biting into her skin. A flicker of pain crossed her face, a brief, tight wince. She clamped her lips together, refusing to make a sound, and forced the ring over the knuckle. It settled, tight and angry, on her finger, a pale circle of skin already puffing up around it. She lowered her hand. "Do you, Jonah Pike?" the Reverend sped on, his eyes fixed on the back wall. "Take this woman." Jonah looked at the dust motes dancing in the lamp's glow. He felt the 21 days pressing on his chest. He smelled the phantom scent of milk from the heifer tied up outside. This was not a woman. This was a season. This was a stay of execution. This was the price. "I do," he said. The words felt like swallowing stones. They scraped his throat and landed heavy in his gut. "And do you, Elowen Hart?" Tolliver turned. "Take this man." Jonah expected her voice to be small, or broken, or angry. It was none of those. It was low, clear, and steady. "I do. By the authority vested in me," the Reverend mumbled. I suppose you are man and wife." He closed the book with a soft thump. For a terrible second, there was silence. Then Mrs. Tolliver, startled into action, began to pump the organ. A wheezing, discordant chord blasted through the chapel, a sound more suited to a funeral than a wedding. It was a sour, bitter note that seemed to hang in the dusty air. Dorn clapped, a single, sharp sound. "Excellent, Reverend, your finest work." He turned to Jonah. "Congratulations, son." The words sounded like a curse. Merritt Vale stepped forward, his face all business. "The contracts are binding." He produced the sealed debt deferral from his satchel and handed it to Jonah. A one-season stay, as agreed, signed by the bank president. Jonah took the paper. It felt heavy as lead. And Vale continued, opening a large ledger of his own. "I am making the official notation, as required by the terms of the guardianship release, that the marriage is contingent upon a cohabitation period. Let's see." He ran a finger down a page. "Ah, yes, 30 consecutive nights of shared residence, commencing this evening. A standard clause, to ensure the stability of the union." Jonah barely heard him. 30 nights, a season, a lifetime. It was all the same. He just wanted the cow. Dorn grunted. "Get her things. Sloane!" Breck Sloane and Lanky Pete went outside for a moment and returned. Elowen, it seemed, did not travel light, but she traveled small. Sloane carried a sturdy oak chest, about the size of a saddlebag, but he held it in a way that suggested it was heavy. Pete carried nothing. Elowen herself held the same tapestry bag she'd had in the saloon. From it, she produced a thick, leather-bound book, almost like a merchant's ledger, and a small, rolled-up sewing kit. She tucked the ledger under her arm and held the kit. Jonah watched her open the kit. Inside, He saw needles, a thimble, and spools of thread. She selected one item, a single, long sewing needle, already threaded with a piece of bright, crimson-red cotton. She held it for a second, then carefully pinned it to the inside of her dress bodice, the red thread dangling for a moment before she tucked it away. "My property," she said, not to Jonah, but to Dorn. It wasn't a question. "It is all yours, my dear," Dorn said, his smile oily. "You are a free woman, and a married one." He gestured to the door. "Now, Mr. Pike, I believe you have a ranch to save, and Bluebell is waiting." Outside, the night had grown colder. The moon, a pale, judgmental eye, bleached the landscape. Bluebell, the blue roan heifer, was tied to the chapel rail. She was beautiful, solid, deep-chested, and clearly pregnant. She was the only living, breathing thing in this whole affair that felt real. Jonah untied his tired bay from where he'd left it, hitched it to his buckboard wagon, and then tied Bluebell's lead rope to the tailgate. The wagon was empty, just as his life had been an hour ago. Elowen, holding her tapestry bag and the leather ledger, waited. Sloane loaded the heavy oak chest into the wagon bed. "A pleasure doing business, Pike," Dorn said. He and his men turned and walked back toward the lights of the Juniper Bell, their shadows merging, leaving Jonah alone with his new wife and his new cow. The ride to Pinyon Bluff was made in absolute, crushing silence. The only sounds were the clack-clack-clack of the iron-rimmed wagon wheels on the rocky road, the plodding hoofs of the bay, and the occasional soft lowing of Bluebell from behind. And in the distance, from the dark ridges of the mesas, a pack of coyotes began to sing. Their yips and howls rose and fell, a desolate, wild chorus that seemed to mock the very idea of civilization, of marriage, of law. Jonah held the reins, his knuckles white. He stared straight ahead, at the pale ribbon of road unfolding in the dark. He could feel her beside him. She was a physical weight on the wagon seat, a solid presence that he could not ignore. He could smell the faint scent of lye soap and dust from her clothes. He refused to look at her. He was trapped. He had traded one prison for another, the prison of debt for the prison of this arrangement. This woman. He felt a cold, hard knot of resentment in his stomach. He had done what he had to do. He had saved the land. He had the cow. He would endure the rest. Elowen, for her part, was just as still. She sat straight-backed, her spine rigid. She held the heavy leather ledger on her lap with one hand and her tapestry bag with the other. She did not look at him. She looked out at the passing landscape, at the skeletal silhouettes of cholla cactus and the black, empty canyons, as if she were memorizing a map. Her face, half hidden in shadow, was impossible to read. She had not spoken a single word to him since I do. After nearly an hour, they crested the last rise. Pinyon Bluff lay below them, a dark wound in the earth. If the chapel had been desolate, his ranch was a graveyard. The cabin was a low, squat shadow against the pale dirt, little more than a pile of logs and hope. The tin roof, pocked with rust, looked like old blood in the moonlight. The corrals were empty, their fences askew. And there was the well. His father had dug it. Jonah had deepened it. Now it was just a hole. The wooden pulley over it was split, the bucket rope frayed and useless. It was the tombstone of all his work. He pulled the wagon to a stop by the cabin. The 3 skeletal longhorns he still owned huddled by the broken corral, watching the newcomer, Bluebell, with dull, incurious eyes. Jonah sat for a long moment, the reins slack in his hands, the silence stretched, filled only by the huff of the tired horse and the howl of the wind through the canyon. He finally turned to her. It was the first time he had truly looked at her since the saloon. Her face was broad, plain, and marked by the sun. But her eyes, even in the darkness, were fixed on him. They were not cowed. They were not afraid. They were waiting. He found he had nothing to say. There were no words for this. He cleared his throat. "The cowshed is over there," he said, his voice a rasp. He gestured with his chin toward the lean-to attached to the small barn. "The heifer goes in." He was talking about the cow. He was telling her his priority. The cow, then the ranch, then whatever this was. Elowen nodded once. She did not ask for help. She did not wait for him. She gathered her ledger and her bag. She used the wagon wheel as a step and climbed down, her movements capable and sure, not clumsy as he might have expected from her size. She went to the back of the wagon and put her hands on the oak chest. Jonah made a move to help. It was reflex, but she had already braced herself and hauled it out. She was strong. She carried the chest in one arm, the bag and ledger in the other, and walked directly to the cabin's front door. She pushed it open and disappeared into the darkness inside. Jonah was left alone in the moonlight. He sat there, feeling strangely numb, before he finally moved. He unhitched Bluebell, his hands gentle on the cow's rope. He led her to the shed, found the last of his clean straw, and made her a bed. He poured the last 3 inches of water from his drinking barrel into a bucket for her. The cow drank deeply. This was real. This animal, this promise of milk in a calf, this was worth the price. He rubbed the cow's broad forehead. "Welcome home, girl," he whispered. Finally, he could delay no longer. He walked to the cabin. The porch boards groaned under his weight. He pushed the door open. The main room was dark. It was a single, large space, with his kitchen table, his cold stove, and his few belongings. But a sliver of yellow light shone from beneath the door to the cabin's only other room, the bedroom, his bedroom. A sudden, cold dread filled him. The 30 nights, the cohabitation. This was the next part of the payment. He felt sick. He had married her. He was her husband. The law said so. Dorn said so. He walked slowly, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He reached the bedroom door. He put his hand on the wooden latch, bracing himself for whatever he would find on the other side. He didn't even have time to press it down. From the other side of the door, there was a sharp, distinct, metallic sound. Click. It was not a latch. It was not a bolt. It was the unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock. Jonah froze, his hand still on the latch. He pushed. Solid. The door was locked. He stared at the wood grain, stunned into silence. The light under the door was still there. She was in his room, and she had locked him out. Jonah's hand was still on the latch. He pushed again, harder this time, putting his shoulder into it. The door was solid. The lock was not some flimsy cabinet latch. It was a real, metal lock, and it held firm. A wave of cold, sharp anger washed over him, momentarily eclipsing the shame and the desperation. He had just sold his name, his pride, and his future for this arrangement. He had held up his end of the bargain. He had brought the cow home, and now he was being locked out of his own bedroom by the woman he had been forced to marry. "What is this?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. He rattled the latch, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. "Open this door." There was no sound of movement from within, no footsteps, no fumbling with the key, just silence. I said, "Open the door. Woman!" he shouted, hitting the flat of his hand against the solid wood. The impact stung his palm. A voice came from the other side, and it startled him into silence. It was not the voice of a frightened victim. It was low, calm, and held no tremor whatsoever. It was the same steady voice that had said "I do" in the chapel. "I will not," she said. Jonah stepped back, breathing hard. He was baffled. This was not the behavior of a bartered bride. This was not the action of a terrified ward. "What in blazes are you doing?" he demanded, his voice dropping from anger to sheer, frustrated confusion. "I am setting my terms," Elowen Pike replied from behind the door. "Your terms?" Jonah let out a short, bitter laugh. "You don't have any terms. The terms were set at the juniper bell. A cow for a season. You're part of the bargain. Now open this door. The bargain you think you made, Mr. Pike, is not the one I made. I will not open the door. Not until dawn. Those are my terms." Jonah scrubbed his face with his hands. He was too tired for this. The drought, the debt, the humiliation, and now this. A madwoman. Dorn had shackled him to a madwoman. He looked around the dark, cold main room. His stove was cold. His bed was occupied. He was a stranger in his own home. "Fine," he spat. He was too exhausted to fight a locked door. "Freeze in there for all I care." He turned, intending to collapse on the thin pallet by the stove, the one he used when the winter nights got too cold. He'd had enough. "You should come in, Mr. Pike," her voice said, still calm, "but I will not be opening the door." He stopped. "What nonsense are you talking you just said?" "The key is in the lock," she said, her voice slightly clearer, as if she were now standing right against the wood. "On your side. I pushed it through." Jonah stared at the door. He knelt, his knees cracking, and there, glinting in the sliver of light from beneath the door, was the dark iron shank of an old key. It was sticking out of the keyhole on his side. He stood up slowly. This was a game, a trick. He turned the key. The lock mechanism, old and stiff, scraped loudly. He heard the bolt retract. He pushed the door open. The small bedroom was illuminated by the single oil lamp she must have found on his dresser and lit. The air was close, smelling of dust and the faint, clean scent of lye soap from her. Elowen was standing at the far side of the room, near his narrow bed. She was not undressed. She had not so much as unlaced her boots. Her back was perfectly straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked like a soldier at ease. Not a bride on her wedding night. The heavy oak chest she'd brought from the chapel was on the floor at her feet. Jonah stood in the doorway, his hand still on the key. He felt a strange unease. The power dynamic he had imagined the resentful husband, the cowed wife, had just been turned completely on its head. He had been locked out, and then invited in, all on her command. "If you were going to let me in," he said, his voice rough, "what was the point of the lock?" "The point," Elowen said, "was the locking itself. It had to be done, and it had to be done by me. You're not making a lick of sense." "Sit down, Mr. Pike," she said, gesturing not to the bed, but to the single, straight-backed wooden chair by his washstand. "We have business to discuss, and it is not the business you are thinking of." He did not move. "I'll stand." She gave a small, indifferent shrug. She knelt beside the oak chest, her movements deliberate. She produced another key, this one small and intricate. From the bodice of her dress, the same place she had tucked the red-threaded needle. She unlocked the chest. Jonah watched, his arms crossed over his chest, his suspicion growing. He expected to see he didn't know what. A wedding dress, perhaps. Linens, things a woman brought to a new home. Elowen lifted the lid. The chest was packed tight, but it was not filled with fabric. It was filled with paper. She lifted out the contents, one by one, and placed them on the worn quilt of his bed. The first item was not a dress, but a large, rolled map, drawn on oiled canvas. The second was a stack of legal-looking documents, bound in twine, and beneath that, a thick, leather-bound book, the one she had carried into the chapel. "You came prepared," Jonah said, his voice flat. "I have been preparing for 7 years," she replied. She unrolled the map, weighting the corners with his candlestick and a bar of soap. Jonah stepped closer, his curiosity overriding his anger. He knew this land like the back of his hand, but he had never seen a map like this. It was a map of the entire valley, from Coppervale to the North Spur. But it wasn't the roads or the property lines that were drawn in detail. It was the waterways. There, in bold blue ink, was the Thunder Wash. And there, at the top, was the dam at Sage Notch, But drawn in a spiderweb of fine, delicate red lines were dozens of other markings, lines that snaked beneath the mesas, that followed canyons he knew to be dry. "What is this?" he asked, his finger tracing one of the red lines that passed directly beneath his own property. "That," Elowen said, "is the Thunder Wash Aquifer, the underground arteries. That is the water Dorn is hoarding. Not just the surface river, but the source." She then picked up the stack of papers. She laid the top one on the table. It was heavy parchment. The ink faded to brown, but the lettering was the precise, elegant script of a legal clerk. At the top it read Garnet Wells District Charter 18. "I am not Silas Dorn's daughter," Elowen said, her voice quiet but ringing with the force of a hammer blow. "I am not his ward. I am his prisoner." Jonah stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening thud. The way Dorn treated her, the way no one knew her story. "My father," she said, tapping the bottom of the charter, where a bold, authoritative signature was just visible, was Judge Alastair Hart. The name hit Jonah like a physical slap. Judge Hart. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Hart was the man who had written the water laws for the entire district 20 years ago. A man known for being severe, eccentric, and fiercely, almost violently, fair. He had died suddenly, maybe 7 or 8 years back. The whole district had mourned him. "Dorn was my father's clerk," Elowen continued, her voice cold as a winter morning. "When my father died, Dorn produced a forged transfer document. It claimed my father, in his final days, signed over the primary rights to the Sage Notch Dam and all adjoining aquifers to him, to Dorn, as payment for his years of service." Jonah felt his stomach clench. The drought, this whole valley, it's not the sky, it's him. "He has been choking the wash for 7 years, Elowen said, letting out just enough to keep people from revolting, but never enough for anyone to prosper. He's been buying up the ranches, one by one, as they fail, just like he was about to buy yours." Jonah sank into the chair. He felt weak. The entire world had just tilted on its axis. His suffering, his dying calf, his neighbor's ruin, it wasn't bad luck. It was a plan. "But this," he said, pointing to the marriage certificate still sticking out of his shirt pocket. "Why this? Why me?" "Because of Merritt Vale's diligence," Elowen said, a flicker of something almost like humor in her eyes. "He mentioned that cohabitation clause, 30 nights. Dorn and Vale put it in to make the marriage look legitimate, to finalize my release from a guardianship that was fraudulent to begin with. They thought it was just a formality, but they don't know my father's laws." She opened the thick leather book. It was her father's personal ledger of legal precedents. She turned to a marked page. "My father believed the law was a shield for the weak. He hated arrangements. He wrote contingencies for things no one else ever considered." She pointed to a passage, her calloused finger tracing the spidery script. "It's an obscure marital rights clause," she explained. "It states that if an heir to a primary water right, that's me, enters into a legal marriage, they may temporarily assign their claim to their spouse's property, for the purpose of establishing a test of fair and equitable use. It was designed to protect a wife's assets from a greedy husband, or vice versa, to allow one partner to act for the other. It triggers a 30-day probationary period." Jonah was lost. "I don't understand. What does that mean?" "It means," Elowen said, her eyes boring into his, "that this marriage, this cohabitation clause that Dorn thinks traps me, is actually the key to the lock. By marrying you, I can legally transfer my father's true water rights to Pinyon Bluff for 30 days, starting tomorrow." She let that sink in. Jonah's mind was racing. Water. Not a season of debt, but water. "But," he said, his mind catching on the snag, "you locked the door. What did that have to do with anything?" Elowen took a deep breath. This, he sensed, was the strangest part of all. "That is the lock," she said. "My father was an eccentric man. He saw how women were treated, how they were forced. He believed a woman's autonomy was the cornerstone of any fair contract. The clause for the 30-day transfer has one very specific, very strange activation requirement. She pointed to the text again. The rights are only assigned if, on the first night of cohabitation, the union is validated by a specific act. The act is this: the bridal chamber door must be locked by the wife, from within, and remain so until the first chime of the dawn bell. Jonah stared at her, speechless. It was his way, Elowen said, a small, sad smile touching her lips for the first time, of ensuring a wife's right to say no. It was his legal way of giving her power on the one night she traditionally had none. If she locked the door, it proved her will was her own. And in proving her will, she activated her control over her property. He turned a lock of refusal into a key of power. So the click, Jonah said, remembering the sound, that was you, fulfilling the law. Yes, I locked it. Then I gave you the key so we could talk. The lock itself, the act of me turning the key, is what matters. It's a symbolic act that the law, his law, recognizes as real. Reverend Tolliver must sign his parish log in the morning, attesting that we began our cohabitation. The church clock will strike 6. The 2 records the lock, and the time will satisfy the charter. I needed you to endure one locked door, Mr. Pike, just for one night, so that I could do this. She took the Charter 18 document. On the back, she unpinned the needle and red thread from her dress. She dipped the pen in the inkwell on his dresser. She wrote a single line, assigning the temporary rights to Pinyon Bluff, and signed her name, Elowen Hart Pike. Tomorrow morning, she said, her voice dropping, when that sun comes up, the water in Sage Notch Dam will legally belong to this ranch for 30 days. And when Silas Dorn comes to stop us, and we will have this. She tapped the charter. We will have the law. Jonah Pike stood up. He walked to the small, grimy window and looked out. He saw his dying land. He saw the dust. But now, in his mind's eye, he saw the red lines on the map. He saw water. He saw a chance, not just to survive, but to fight. He turned back to her. She was watching him, her face calm, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the ledger. She had wagered everything on him. You did all this, he said, his voice quiet with awe. This entire trap. But you needed a husband. Why me? Why a man about to lose everything? Elowen finally looked away, down at her own calloused hands. Dorn has been trying to marry me off for a year, to one of his own cronies, to legally seize my claim. I've refused them all. But my time was running out. I needed someone. Desperate. Someone Dorn thought he could control. She looked up, her gaze meeting his, clear and unflinching. I've watched you, Mr. Pike. I saw you in town. I saw you try to reason with the bank. I saw you haul water from the trickle in the wash when other men had already given up. Dorn thinks you're weak because you're poor. I think you're strong because you're still here. She paused. I needed a husband who knew how to stand his ground, even when his ground was nothing but dust. I needed a man who wouldn't break. Jonah stood there, the weight of her words settling on him. This was not about a cow. It had never been about the cow. He felt a slow, unfamiliar burn rise in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't shame. It was something else. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He said, his voice thick. I married you for a cow. Elowen allowed herself another small, weary smile. She gestured to the map. The charter, the book, and I married you for a river. We all have our reasons. Mr. Pike, the question is, now that we are allied, what do we do next? He looked at the locked door, and then at her. He was beginning to understand. We wait, Jonah said. We wait for the dawn bell. The silence that followed her explanation was as profound as the darkness outside the small window. The single lamp on the dresser cast a small, brave circle of yellow light, pushing back against the shadows that crowded the corners of the room. The map, spread across the bed, looked like a living thing, its red-inked veins promising a life that Pinyon Bluff had been denied for 7 long years. Jonah finally let out the breath he'd been holding. It felt like he'd been underwater. "So," he said, his voice quiet, "we wait for the bell at 6. We wait for Tolliver." "We wait," Elowen agreed. She walked back to the door, the one he had entered. "But the law is precise. The room must remain unlocked by the wife." My father's words. I turned the key. But now? She looked at the key, still in the lock on the inside of the room. "Now we must ensure the intent is proven, that the seal is not broken." She reached into the small sewing kit she had carried. From it, she took the long needle with the crimson thread. Jonah watched, fascinated, as she then produced a small, flat ribbon of brown linen, with deft, practiced movements. She looped the ribbon through the handle of the key and then around the door's iron latch bar. Her hands were quick. She was not fumbling. She passed the needle through the linen, stitching it tight, pulling the key and the latch into a single, bound unit. She didn't just loop it, she sewed it shut. She made 3, 4, 5 passes, the red thread a stark, bright line against the drab linen and dark iron. Finally, she knotted it with a sharp, decisive pull. "There," she said, stepping back. She touched the thread. A simple stitch. But if that thread is broken, if this ribbon is torn, any man, even a corrupt one, would have to testify that the door was opened. It was a brilliant, simple, physical piece of evidence. A frontier seal. Jonah stepped closer. The red thread was thin, taut. He reached out a finger, his curiosity getting the better of him. He was about to pluck it, just to feel the tension. "Don't!" Her voice was sharp. He froze. Elowen's hand shot out and slapped his hand away from the door. It wasn't a violent blow, but it was sudden and strong. A crackle of warning. He pulled his hand back as if stung. Her eyes met his. There was no anger in them, but a fierce, absolute seriousness. "This isn't a game, Mr. Pike. That thread is my father's signature. It is our entire legal case. You touch it, you break it, and you break this pact. You break it, and Silas Dorn wins. Do you understand?" He looked from her intense, unwavering gaze to the small, fragile thread. He had been a fool. He had thought of it as a curiosity. To her, it was a shield. It was the only thing standing between her and ruin. "I understand," he said, his voice whooping arse. He stepped away from the door, putting a deliberate distance between himself and the seal. "I won't touch it." She watched him for another long moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied that he grasped the stakes. She turned from the door, the tension draining from her shoulders. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It was filled with the shared secret, the map, the waiting. It was the silence of 2 conspirators. The small room, his own bedroom, suddenly felt incredibly small, charged with her presence. He was trapped in here with a stranger who had just made him the single most dangerous threat to the most powerful man in the valley. He cleared his throat. "You can have the bed. I'll take the chair, or the floor. We are both waiting for the dawn bell." "Mr. Pike," she said, moving to the small chair herself and sitting down. "Neither of us will sleep. We should talk." He remained standing, restless. He walked to the window, pushed aside the threadbare curtain, and stared out into the blackness. He could just see the outline of the barn where Bluebell was, the cow he'd married for. "What's at Cedar Trace?" she asked. He stiffened. He turned from the window to look at her. "How do you know that name?" "I told you. I watched you. I listened." She said, "Men at the Juniper Bell. They talk. They said you came from Cedar Trace with nothing but a saddle and a temper." Jonah's jaw tightened. Cedar Trace. He hadn't thought of that place in years. "It was good land," he said, his voice distant, his eyes on the past. "Not like this. It was green. In the foothills. My father, he left it to me. I had a herd. Almost 60 head. I had a house, a real one, with glass windows. He walked to the cold stove, leaning against it. Then came the storm. It wasn't a blizzard, not at first. It was rain. It rained for 9 straight days. An early storm. In October, the creek rose. We didn't think. And then it turned. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour. The rain turned to sleet, then to ice, a flash freeze. He remembered the sound, the cracking of the trees, the world turning to glass. The herd, they were in the lower pasture. The creek flooded, and the ice came. They were trapped. They froze standing up. 60 head. Gone. The house was ice. The barn roof collapsed. I lost it all in one night. The bank took the land by Christmas. That was 5 years ago. I came here with what I could carry. Pinyon Bluff was all I could afford, a place no one else wanted. He fell silent. He hadn't told that story to anyone. He'd buried it. Elowen watched him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. You lost it to the weather. My father lost his to the law. What do you mean? Jonah asked. I thought he died. He did, she said, but he was dying for a year before that. He was a man obsessed. He believed the law was a living thing, a garden. He said if you didn't tend it every day, weeds like Silas Dorn would grow and choke it. She looked down at her hands, clasped in her lap. He was a lonely man. My mother died when I was young. It was just him and me and the books. He wasn't a warm man. He didn't talk of feelings. He talked of precedents, of equity, of riparian rights. He taught me to read from his law books. She held up her hands. Jonah had seen they were calloused. Now, in the lamplight, he saw something else. The pads of her fingers, especially on her right hand, were dotted with tiny, pale scars, the kind of pinpricks that came from years of needlework. When he died, she said, her voice dropping, Dorn was kind. At first, he was the executor. He said my father had left debts. He said I was a young woman, unmarried, and that he would be my guardian. He would protect my interests. It was a lie. He isolated me. He took the house. He took the books. He gave me a room at the back of his own home, and he put me to work. Work, Jonah asked, picturing her slaving in Dorn's kitchen. He thought it was fitting, ironic. He made me his seamstress, mending his silk waistcoats, hemming his curtains, for 7 years. I was the ward of the richest man in the valley, and I lived by the needle. She smiled, a bitter, fleeting expression. He didn't know I had my father's ledger. The one I brought tonight, I'd hidden it, and he didn't know what I was doing when I was on errands. I took in extra work. I went to Hollow Ridge and taught the miners' wives how to sew, how to patch their husbands' canvas trousers, for pennies. But I wasn't just sewing. She leaned forward, her eyes bright. I was living, I was listening, I was waiting. I studied that book every night. I learned every clause, every loophole my father had ever written. And I planned. I planned to use the one thing Dorn wanted my marriage against him. Jonah looked at her with new eyes. This was not just a large, plain woman from the back of a saloon. This was a scholar, a survivor, a fighter, armed not with a pistol, but with a needle and a book. The cabin was growing cold. The night was settling in. Jonah, needing to do something, moved to the stove. I can make coffee, he offered. It's all I have. It'll be black. That would be fine, she said. He busied himself with the familiar motions, splitting a little kindling, starting a small fire in the stove, filling the pot from his water barrel, which was itself perilously low. The smell of wood smoke and, soon, the rich, bitter aroma of boiling coffee filled the small cabin. It was a domestic sound, a domestic smell. In the midst of this legal conspiracy, it felt deeply, strangely normal. He poured the black, steaming liquid into 2 tin cups. He handed one to her. She took it, wrapping both her hands around the cup for warmth. She took a sip. Her face immediately pinched. Her eyes watered slightly, and she pursed her lips, trying not to spit it out. It was a completely unguarded, human reaction. She stammered. It's very strong. Jonah couldn't help it. A small chuckle escaped him. It's ranch coffee. Ma'am, we make it so a spoon will stand up in it. Do you have any honey or sugar? She asked, looking hopefully toward his shelves. Jonah's brief moment of humor died. He turned and picked up the small, empty stoneware tin marked sugar. He took the lid off and held it out. It was empty. Dust. I haven't had sugar in 2 months. Mrs. Pike, or honey, or much of anything. Elowen looked from the empty tin to his face. She saw the sudden shame there, the stark reminder of the poverty that had driven him to this bargain. And then she did something that shocked him more than the map. She laughed. It wasn't a giggle. It was a low, genuine, throaty chuckle, a laugh that came from a place of shared understanding. Of course, she said, setting the cup down. My father was the same. He drank it so bitter it could strip paint. He said sugar was a distraction. She looked at the cup. Well, I suppose I can learn to be undistracted. And Jonah smiled. Not a bitter twist of the lips, but a real, actual smile. It felt rusty. Here, he said. He took her cup, poured half of it out, and refilled it with water from the barrel, diluting it. Try that. She took it, sipped, and nodded. Better. Thank you. That one small moment, the shared bitterness and the small act of service, broke the last of the ice. The formality between them began to thaw. All right, Jonah said, pulling his own chair over. We wait. Show me the map again. Show me exactly where this water is. They moved from the chairs to the bed. It was the only large, flat surface in the room. They spread the map out on the worn quilt. This time, they sat side by side, their shoulders brushing. Jonah could feel the solid warmth of her through his thin shirt. She was not soft, but she was warm, and she was real. This, she said, her finger tracing the main red artery, is the aquifer. My father charted it. See how it runs from the mountains. Right under the Sage-Notch Dorns Dam isn't just stopping the surface river. His foundations go deep. He's plugging the source. But look, Jonah said, his excitement growing. He pointed to a spot on the map, a place he knew well. Willow Cut. It's dry as a bone, but your map says there's a spring there, just 10 feet down. A secondary channel, Elowen confirmed. If the pressure from the main dam is released, even a little, my father believed this entire network of secondary springs would come back to life. It wouldn't just be the main river. The whole valley floor would get damp again. Your well, she traced a line to his cabin. It's not dry. Mr. Pike, it's just waiting. They bent over the map, their heads close. He could smell the lye soap on her skin and the scent of the starch in her dress. He was acutely aware of her arm pressed against his. He looked up from the map, at her profile in the lamplight. Her face was earnest, focused, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. She was not the saloon shadow. She was not the fat stranger the town whispered about. She was Elowen. Why me? He asked again, his voice softer this time. She stopped talking about the map and turned to face him. They were very close. I told you I needed someone strong, someone who wouldn't break. No, he said. There are other ranchers just as desperate. Hal Jessup, Old Man Hemlock. Why me? Elowen held his gaze. Her eyes were clear, and for the first time, he saw a deep, profound vulnerability there. Because, she said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, when Silas Dorn pointed at me in that saloon, when every other man in that room looked at me, they looked at me like I was a burden, a piece of livestock, a problem to be solved. She paused. You looked at me like a person. You looked me in the eye. You saw my hands. I saw you see them. You looked at me like a man looks at a woman he's about to make a terrible deal with. Maybe, but you looked at me, not the idea of me. She took a breath. I told you my other reason. Because you're poor, but not dirty. I've watched you. You haven't stolen from your neighbors. You haven't cheated anyone. You haul your own water. I knew if I gave you this, if I gave you the law, you wouldn't use it to become another Silas Dorn. You'd use it to make things right. I was betting on your character, Jonah Pike. I bet my life on it. Jonah had no words. He had been so consumed by his own shame. He had never considered the transaction from her perspective. She hadn't been a victim in that saloon. She had been a predator. She had been choosing. The wind howled outside, rattling the single window pane in its frame. The cabin was a tiny, fragile island in the vast, dark, thirsty desert. The red thread on the door latch, caught in a draft from under the door, vibrated slightly. It hummed, a low, quiet note. Elowen shivered. A small, involuntary movement. She pulled her shawl tighter. She glanced at the dark window, then quickly away. For all her strength, for all her planning, Jonah saw it. She was afraid of the dark. Or perhaps just afraid of what was in the dark. Jonah stood. He didn't say anything. He walked to the dresser, picked up the oil lamp, their only source of light, and brought it back, placing it on the floor between them. The light was warmer now, lower, casting their shadows large against the log walls. He sat down again, not on the bed, but on the floor, his back against the bed frame. Elowen watched him. She looked at the lamp, and the warmth it brought, and her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. Jonah leaned his head back against the quilt. He was exhausted. He saw a smudge of dust on the shoulder of his own shirt, near his collar, likely from the barn. Elowen, seeing his gaze, hesitated. Then, in a gesture that was almost impossibly awkward, impossibly brave, she leaned forward. She raised her hand, the one with the needle-pricked fingers, and brushed the dust from his collar. Her fingers barely touched his skin, just a graze of her knuckles against his neck. But it was the first time they had touched in a way that wasn't a warning. It was a small, domestic, caring gesture. Jonah's heart gave a single, hard thump against his ribs. It was a jolt so powerful it took his breath. He didn't move. He barely breathed. Elowen snatched her hand back, as if she, too, had been burned. A faint flush rose on her cheeks. There was dust, she murmured, looking at her lap. "Thank you," he managed to say. They sat there, in the circle of lamplight, not talking. The map lay forgotten on the bed above them. The night wore on. The coffee grew cold. The oil in the lamp burned low. Eventually, Elowen's breathing deepened. Her head, which had been upright, began to nod. She fought it, but exhaustion was claiming her. Jonah, too, felt his eyelids grow heavy as lead. He stayed on the floor. She stayed in the chair. After another hour, as the first gray pre-dawn light began to stain the window, he looked over. Elowen had finally succumbed. She had slumped in the chair, her head resting uncomfortably against the hard wooden back. Jonah stood, his joints protesting. He looked at the bed. He looked at her. He looked at the red-threaded seal. He gently took her shoulder. "Mrs. Pike, Elowen." She startled awake, her eyes wide with momentary panic. "What is it time?" "No, not yet," he said. "But you'll break your neck sleeping like that. Come, sit on the floor. You can lean against the bed." She looked at him, wary, but the exhaustion was too strong. She nodded. She moved from the chair to the floor, mirroring him, her back against the bed frame, a few feet away. Jonah sat down again. The space between them was small, but absolute. He listened to the wind. She listened to the dark. Sometime in that last cold hour before morning, he must have drifted. When he opened his eyes again, the gray light was stronger. He felt a strange weight against his arm. Elowen had slumped sideways in her sleep. Her head was resting on his shoulder. He sat perfectly still, not daring to move. He could feel the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing. She was heavy against him, and solid, and real. He was acutely aware of the coarse fabric of her dress, the warmth of her body. He looked at the door. The seal was intact. The red thread was unbroken. He closed his eyes again, just for a moment, and leaned his own head lightly against hers. They were not husband and wife. They were two soldiers, sharing a scrap of warmth in a trench, waiting for the battle that would begin at dawn. A low, resonant bong echoed across the valley, traveling on the cold morning air. Jonah's eyes snapped open. The weight of Elowen's head on his shoulder was the first thing he registered. The sound was the second. Elowen shot upright, instantly awake, her hand flying to her chest. "The bell," she whispered. "Bong!" The sound was faint but clear. The bell of the Mesa Laurel Chapel. "Bong!" Jonah scrambled to his feet, his legs stiff and cramped from sleeping on the floor. He felt a sudden, strange emptiness where her head had been. Bong! Elowen was already at the door, her back to him. He watched her. She was not fumbling. She was not panicked. She was methodical. Bong! She took a small, sharp penknife from her skirt pocket. She did not rip the linen ribbon or break the thread. She carefully, precisely, inserted the blade of the knife and cut the single, taut, crimson thread. Bong! The sixth and final chime. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. The legal requirement was met. She unlaced the linen ribbon from the latch and the key, her fingers moving with the deftness of a surgeon. She folded the ribbon, with the severed red thread still stitched through it, and tucked it into the pages of her father's thick leather ledger. She then pulled the key from the lock, stepped back, and turned the handle. The door swung open, revealing the cold, gray light of the main room. The cabin was freezing. The sun was not yet over the eastern mesa, but the sky was a pale, promising pearl. "He will be here soon," she said, her voice practical. She went to the washstand, poured a little of their precious water into the bowl, and dampened a cloth. She washed her face, her movements brisk, businesslike. She was no longer a conspirator in the dark. She was a general preparing for battle. Jonah did the same, the cold water a shock that cleared his head. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to tame it. He was a married man. He was, apparently, a revolutionary. He stepped outside. The air was so cold it bit at his lungs. The sky was clear, promising another day of relentless sun. But the air felt different. It felt charged. He went to the shed. Bluebell lowed softly at his approach. He gave her a rub on the head, his heart thumping. "Today, girl," he whispered. "Today, we see." He heard the sound of a horse before he saw it. Not a wagon, a single rider. Coming up the path to the cabin, looking tired and miserable, was Reverend Tolliver. He was hunched in his thin coat, his hat pulled low. He looked like a man on his way to a hanging. Elowen was waiting on the porch, her ledger held in one arm, her tapestry bag in the other. She looked as solid and immovable as the mesa behind her. "Reverend," she greeted him, her voice polite but firm. "Mrs. Pike," Tolliver mumbled, avoiding her eyes. He dismounted, fumbling with a parish logbook he'd pulled from his saddlebag. "I am here, as required, to note the commencement of the cohabitation." He opened the book on his saddle, his fingers clumsy with cold, to attest to the first night. "We are here, Reverend," Elowen said. Tolliver nodded, his face pale. "Yes, I see. I will make the notation." He uncapped a small inkpot and prepared to write. "You will note the time, please." "Reverend," Elowen said, "as attested by your own chapel bell. 6 o'clock, and you will note that the legal requirement of the bridle lock, as per Charter 18, was fulfilled." Tolliver's head snapped up. His eyes widened in genuine shock. "Charter 18. I don't know what you mean. I am just here to sign the parish log. You are here. Reverend, Elowen said, her voice dropping, to be a witness, as my father intended. You know his laws. You studied under him, did you not? Tolliver's face went from pale to ashen. That was a long time ago. You know what Charter 18, Subclause 4, entails? She pressed, not unkindly, but with the unyielding pressure of a river against a weak dam. You know his requirement, and I am telling you, as an officer of the court which you are, that it was fulfilled. Before he could answer, another sound filled the air. This was not a single rider. This was a party. Jonah stepped out from the shed, his hand moving instinctively to the empty holster on his hip. He'd left his gun belt inside. A fool's move. Coming up the road, moving fast, was a black buggy. Silas Dorn was driving it, his whip cracking. Beside him was his lawyer, Merritt Vale, clutching his briefcase, and riding behind them, on their big, mean-looking horses, were Breck Sloan and Lanky Pete. They weren't coming to offer congratulations. They were coming to ensure the lock was on the cage. Dorn pulled the buggy to a halt so sharp it sent dust flying. He stared at the scene. He saw Jonah, alive. He saw Elowen standing on the porch, looking perfectly composed. And he saw Reverend Tolliver, frozen with his pen over his book. Dorn's face, which had been set in a self-satisfied smile, darkened. Reverend, you're early, just doing your rounds. I see. I am here for the parish log. Mr. Dorn, Tolliver stammered. The Pike marriage? Yes, Dorn said, climbing down from the buggy. He was a spider checking his web. Good. See that it's done. Elowen took a step forward. He is Mr. Dorn. He is just about to sign, attesting that the first night of cohabitation has been legally commenced, and that the heart provision of Charter 18 has been met. If she had fired a pistol, the effect could not have been more dramatic. Merritt Vale, who was climbing down, froze with one foot on the step. Silas Dorn's head swiveled toward her, his eyes narrowing to slits. What? Dorn said, his voice a low, cold hiss. Did you say? Charter 18, Mr. Dorn, Elowen said, her voice carrying in the still morning air. The spousal assignment clause, the one my father wrote to protect an heir's assets, the one that activates upon a marriage, contingent on the bridal lock provision, the one that assigns my true water rights from Sage Notch Dam to this property, Pinion Bluff, for a probationary period of 30 days, for the purpose of testing fair and equitable use. She had laid all her cards on the table. The silence that followed was absolute. Jonah watched Dorn. The man's face went through a remarkable transformation. It went from ruddy to pale, to a deep, blotchy purple. His eyes looked like they were about to burst from his head. Merritt Vale finally spoke, his voice a panicked squeak. That's preposterous. That clause is archaic, it's symbolic, it has no standing. It has every standing, Mr. Vale, Elowen said. She held up her father's ledger. It was sealed by Judge Alastair Hart himself, with the purple ink of the Garnet Wells District Court. An ink, as you know, that is impossible to forge, as it is mixed with a specific, proprietary binder. My father's signature and his seal are on that clause. Dorn finally found his voice. It was a roar. You deceitful, ungrateful cow, I gave you a home, I fed you, and you plot this fantasy against me. You gave me a prison, Silas, Elowen said. Her voice as calm as his was furious. You stole my father's legacy, and you used me as a servant. Now, the law, my father's law, is going to take it back. Law Dorn spat on the ground. This is my valley, I make the law here. He pointed a shaking finger at Tolliver. Reverend, you sign that logbook as I tell you. You write what I say. You write that this provision was not met. Reverend Tolliver looked like he was going to be sick. He looked from Dorn's furious face to Elowen's calm one. He was trapped. I cannot, Mr. Dorn, Tolliver whispered, his voice trembling. She is correct. The provision, it is real. I cannot perjure myself on a heart charter. It is a binding district oath. Dorn took a step toward the Reverend, his hand raised. You weak-spined. He doesn't have to, Jonas said, stepping forward. He moved to stand beside Elowen on the porch. He was unarmed, but he stood his ground. The law is the law. Dorn, even for you. Dorn's gaze snapped to Jonah. The hatred in it was pure. You were nothing. I gave you this. I gave you that cow. I saved your pathetic ranch. You didn't give me anything. Dorn, Jonah said, you bought a husband, but you bought the wrong one. By now, the sound of the confrontation had traveled. A wagon was coming up the road. It was Hal Jessup, Jonah's neighbor from the adjoining section, the one who had looked away in the saloon. He was with his 2 sons. He'd clearly heard the shouting and come to investigate. What's going on? Jonah Hal called, pulling his wagon to a stop. Silas Dorn is trying to threaten the Reverend. Hal, Jonah called back, his voice steady. He's angry because my wife, Elowen Hart Pike, has just invoked her father's water rights, the rights to the Sage Notch Dam. The words spread like wildfire in the dry grass. Hal Jessup's jaw dropped. She's a Hart, he said, his voice full of awe. She is, Elowen said, and this morning, the rights to the Thunder Wash belong to Pinyon Bluff. We are going to open the gate. Open the gate. Jessup was out of his wagon now. My God, Elowen, is it true? It is, she said. Dorn, you can't stop this, Jonah said. It's legal. Dorn was shaking with rage. He looked at Jessup, and he saw other figures now, on foot, coming from the next ranch over. The news was spreading. The entire valley was waking up. He turned to his men. Breck, Lanky, go to the dam. No one touches that wheel. You hear me? No one. If they try, you stop them. Breck Sloan, who had been watching with a smirk, touched the brim of his hat. You got it, boss. He and Lanky Pete wheeled their horses and galloped off, heading north toward the dam. Dorn turned back to Elowen. He was trying to regain his composure, to find a legal footing. You are an imposter, he hissed. You are a fraud. You are no Hart. You are a nameless orphan I took in. You have no proof. That book is a forgery. Elowen watched him. She seemed to have been waiting for this. I was wondering when you would say that, she said. She reached into her tapestry bag. She took out a small, leather-backed case. She unhooked the clasp and opened it. It was a daguerreotype, an old, faded photograph, the kind that took long minutes to expose. She handed it to Hal Jessup. Hal took it, his rough hands gentle. He stared at it. He whispered. He held it up. The photograph was of 2 people, a tall, stern-looking man with a severe face and a judge's cravat, standing next to a sign that read, Garnet Wells Courthouse, District Judge A. Hart. And beside him, her hand tucked into his arm, was a young girl of about 12. She was large for her age and plain, and she was staring at the camera with the same steady, unblinking, serious eyes that were now watching Silas Dorn. That's him, Hal breathed. That's Judge Hart. And that's you. The farmers who had gathered crowded around, murmuring, it was proof. It was real. Dorn saw the tide turn. He saw the looks on the ranchers' faces. He had lost control. This changes nothing, he bellowed. My men are at the dam. The water stays put. You have a piece of paper. I have the gate. We'll see which one is stronger. We'll see you in court, if you live that long. He turned to his lawyer. Merritt, we're leaving. He climbed into his buggy, whipped the horse, and tore off down the road, leaving Merritt Vale to scramble in after him. The dust settled. It was quiet again. Reverend Tolliver, his hands shaking, finally signed the parish logbook. He wrote Jonah Pike and Elowin Hart Pike. First night of cohabitation commenced. Hart Charter 18 invoked. 6 o'clock, October 4th. He snapped the book shut. It is done, he said. He looked at Elowin, his eyes full of a new, grudging respect. God help you, child. You've woken the devil. He climbed on his horse and rode away. A man who had, for the first time in years, chosen the right side. Jonah looked at Elowin. She was pale, but her hands were steady. He looked at Hal Jessup and the other 2 ranchers who had gathered. They looked stunned, hopeful, and terrified. Well, Jonah said, his voice ringing in the morning air. She has the law. Dorn has the gate. Let's go see which one is stronger. He strode to the barn, his heart hammering. He didn't go for his gun. He went for a shovel. Hal, he said, I need to clear the old ditch, the one that runs by your property. If that water comes, it needs a place to go. Hal Jessup stared at him for a second. Then a slow grin spread across his face. My boys and I, we were just heading out to check our fences. Seems a good day to check the fences along that ditch. Jonah grabbed the lead rope for Bluebell. He untied his 2 remaining skeletal longhorns. Come on, girl, he said to the heifer. You've waited long enough. He led his tiny, pathetic herd, 2 ghosts and a promise toward the dry, cracked bed of the irrigation channel that snaked away from the thunder wash. It was choked with silt and dead tumbleweeds. He and Elowin walked side by side. Behind them, Hal and his sons, carrying shovels and picks from their wagon, followed, and behind them, 2 more ranchers, May Ashford's oldest boy and Old Man Hemlock, were hurrying to catch up, tools in hand. A rumor of water was more powerful than a call to arms. They reached the head of the ditch, a mile from the cabin, where it met the main, dry riverbed, and in the distance, another mile up, they could see the Sage Notch Dam. It was a massive wall of timber and rock, and on top of it, they could see 2 small figures, Breck Sloan and Lanky Pete, rifles in their hands. They'll shoot, Hal said, his voice low. They won't, Elowin said, her voice certain. Not in front of this many witnesses. They are there to stop us from turning the wheel. They are not expecting the water to come to them. She held up the charter. Jonah Pike, as is your right under this provision, you will now go to the dam and demand your probationary allotment. Jonah handed the lead ropes to Hal. He looked at Elowin. She had just ordered him to walk into the guns of 2 known killers. But she was right. It had to be done by the book. He nodded once. He started walking. He walked alone, up the dry, rocky riverbed toward the dam. He felt the eyes of his neighbors on his back. He felt the rifles of Dorn's men on his chest. He stopped about 50 yards from the base of the dam. Breck Sloan, he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. He saw Sloan lean over the edge. That's far enough. Pike, turn around and go home. I am here, as the legal holder of the Hart water rights. To open this gate, Jonah yelled. This gate ain't opening, Sloan shouted back, lifting his rifle. One more step, and you're a dead man. I don't have to take another step, Sloan Jonah shouted, his voice raw. You are in violation of a district charter. You are obstructing the law, and we have witnesses. Your witnesses can watch you bleed. So shoot me, Jonah roared, taking a defiant step forward. In front of half the valley, Dorn will hang for it. You both will. Sloan hesitated. He looked back at Pete. He hadn't expected this. At that moment, Elowin's voice, clear and powerful, rose from behind Jonah. Mr. Sloan, we are not here to touch your gate. We are here to receive the water. You have been legally notified. If that gate is not opened in 1 minute, you will be in contempt of Judge Hart's charter. And Deputy Lyle from Garnet Wells will be summoned to arrest you. The mention of Deputy Lyle, a man known to be as stubborn as the judge himself, was the final blow. Jonah could see them arguing. Sloan was gesturing wildly. Pete was pointing back at the growing crowd of ranchers. Finally, Sloan spat over the side of the dam. Fine, you want your water. Have it. He wasn't going to open the main wheel. He wasn't going to give them the river. They saw Sloane and Pete heave at a smaller, secondary release lever. It was the silt gate, the one used to flush mud and debris from the base of the dam. There was a groaning of metal, a plume of black. Sludgy mud spurted from a pipe at the dam's base. And then, behind it, water. It was not a flood, it was a stream, maybe as thick as a man's arm, but it was clean, and it was cold, and it was real. It hit the dusty riverbed with a sound like a gasp. It soaked in, then formed a puddle, then a trickle, and began to snake its way down the channel. A cheer went up from the ranchers. It was a ragged, hoarse sound, the sound of men who had forgotten how to hope. The water reached Jonah's feet. He looked down as the dark, life-giving liquid soaked the dust around his boots. He knelt, cupped his hands, and drank. It was the coldest, sweetest water he had ever tasted. He stood up and looked back. Elowen was watching him. He raised his wet hand to her, a small salute. The water, that blessed tiny stream, made its way to the ditch, where Hal and the others quickly diverted it. It wasn't enough to save the valley. Not yet, but it was a start. It was a victory. Jonah walked back to the group, his boots muddy. He and Hal and the others dug for an hour, channeling the small flow, making sure not a drop was wasted. As the sun climbed higher, they saw Dornenvale return, this time with the sheriff from Coppervale, a man known to be in Dorn's pocket. They stood on the dam for a long time, staring down. Finally, they turned and left. The water, for now, continued to flow. That evening, as the sun set, Jonah and Elowen stood on their porch. The small stream was flowing steadily into a makeshift pool they had dug. Bluebell and the other cows drinking deeply. "It's not much," Jonah said. "It's enough," Elowen replied. "It's the law. It's a foothold." Dorn's buggy rode past on the main road, not stopping. Dorn's face was a mask of fury in the twilight. He yelled one thing as he passed, his voice drifting to them on the wind. 30 days. Pike. That's all you get. Then you'll be drier than you were before. You'll thirst again." Jonah watched him go. He looked at Elowen. "He's right," Jonah said. 30 days isn't enough to break him." "No," Elowen said, her hand resting on the ledger she still carried. "But it's enough time to prove that his entire claim is based on a forged seal. It's enough time to take him to a real judge. It's enough time to let mat kondau jiakua ong." Jonah nodded. He felt a strange, fierce pride. He looked at this woman, this stranger, his wife. They had won the first battle. That night, Jonah made his bed on the pallet in the main room. Elowen took the bedroom. There was no talk of locks. But just before he fell into an exhausted sleep, Jonah heard a sound outside, a crunch of gravel. Not a coyote, a boot. He grabbed his rifle and was at the door in a second. He flung it open. There was no one there. The yard was empty, bathed in moonlight. He stepped onto the porch, and he saw it. There, in the soft dust right by his doorstep, was a single, deep boot print. It was large, made by a heavy, worn heel. It wasn't his boot. It wasn't Elowen's. It hadn't been there when they came in. It was a message, a threat. The war had just begun. Jonah was dead asleep on the pallet, a sleep so deep it was almost a surrender to the exhaustion of the past 24 hours. He was dreaming of water, of a cold, clear river, when the smell jerked him awake. It was not the clean, resinous scent of his stove's wood smoke. This was acrid, oily. This was hay. He was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, his heart lurching. The main room of the cabin was flickering with a sick, bright orange light. It was coming from the yard. He grabbed his rifle from beside the door, the habit of a man who lived alone, and burst onto the porch. The night was on fire. His haystack, the small, precious mound of winter feed he'd spent weeks scrounging and cutting, was a roaring inferno. Flames leaped 30 feet into the black sky. A column of swirling, spiteful light. Sparks rained down, catching on the dry dust. His first thought was the boot print. Dorn. This was the answer. This was the rebuttal to the law. His second thought was Bluebell. The wind, a hot, dry draft, was blowing from the haystack directly toward the small barn and the cowshed. Sparks were already landing on the tinder-dry wooden roof. "No!" he roared, a sound of pure desperation. The bedroom door flew open behind him. Elowen was there, silhouetted against the firelight. She had not been asleep. She was fully dressed, her boots on. She had clearly been sitting in the dark, just as he had, waiting. She didn't scream. She didn't ask what was happening. Her eyes took in the scene in one sharp, assessing glance: the fire, the wind, the shed. "The cows!" Jonah yelled. "Already running! I have to get the cows out!" "No," her voice cut through his panic. "Sharp as steel. You open that shed door, the sparks will fly in. The wind will turn it into a chimney. We have to soak the wall." She was right. He stopped, his mind racing. Water. They needed water. "The pool," he yelled. He dropped his rifle and sprinted to the cabin, grabbing the 2 empty wooden buckets by the door. He ran, his boots pounding the hard earth, toward the small, muddy basin at the end of the ditch, the tiny, precious stream of water they had won. It was barely a puddle, a shallow, muddy scrape. It would have to be enough. He plunged the buckets in, scraping the bottom. He hauled them out, heavy and sloshing, and ran back. He threw the water, both buckets, in a high arc against the side of the cowshed. The water hissed, turning instantly to steam, disappearing into the scorching wood. It had done almost nothing. The heat was a physical wall, pushing him back. He turned to run for more, and saw Elowen. She was not idle. She was at his wagon, wrestling with the heavy, oiled canvas tarp used to cover loads. She was pulling it free, dragging the massive, stiff sheet of fabric across the yard. "The tarp," she yelled, her voice strained with the effort. "If we can wet it and hang it against the wall, it will screen the embers." He understood. He dropped the buckets and ran to help her. The tarp was impossible, heavy. Together, they dragged it, stumbling in the flickering, chaotic light. They got it to the shed wall. "More water," she gasped. He left her to hold the tarp and ran back to the pool. He filled the buckets. He ran back. He threw one bucket onto the tarp Elowen was holding up, soaking a patch of it. He threw the other onto the roof, where a small curl of smoke was rising. This was impossible. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a tin cup. The fire roared, a living, hungry beast, and the shed was groaning, the wood itself drying and beginning to smoke. "We need help," Jonah yelled, his throat raw, his eyes stinging. "Help is here," a voice shouted from the darkness. A wagon was careening up the path, its wheels throwing stones. Hal Jessup was whipping his horses, his 2 teenage sons in the back, all of them holding buckets, and behind them, running on foot, carrying a yoke with 2 pails of her own, was May Ashford, the widow from the next ranch over. "It's Dorn's work," Hal bellowed as he leaped from the wagon. "We saw the glow, May. Get the women, start a line." In minutes, the yard was full. It was not just Hal and May. It was Old Man Hemlock and the 2 Greer brothers from the canyon. The valley was coming. They formed a line, a human chain, from the small, muddy pool to the threatened shed. Men, women, even Hal's oldest boy, their faces grim and set in the firelight. Jonah took his place nearest the fire, the position of most danger. Hal was beside him, throwing water onto the roof. Elowen was on his other side, her skirt soaked, her face streaked with soot, stubbornly holding her section of the canvas tarp against the hottest part of the wall. "Keep it wet," she shouted to Jonah. He threw his next bucket, dousing her and the tarp. She didn't flinch, just braced herself. They worked. They were a machine. The only sounds were the roar of the flames, the hiss of the water, and the grunts of the people fighting. The haystack was a mountain of fire, but the shed wall, soaked and steaming, was holding. The main support beam of the old haystack, a massive timber post, had been burning from the base. It gave a sudden, groaning crack. "It's coming down," Hal yelled. The column of fire leaned, then broke, collapsing in on itself in a tidal wave of sparks and burning hay. A blast of heat, like an open furnace, exploded outward. Elowen, who had been focused on the wall, was blinded by the sudden, volcanic plume of smoke and embers. She cried out, throwing her arm up to shield her face, and stumbled backward. Her foot caught on one of the buckets, and she went down. She fell, not onto the ground, but into Jonah. He had been turning to get another bucket. He saw her fall. He dropped the pail and moved without thinking. He caught her. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a collision. His arms clamped around her instinctively, pulling her upright, shielding her with his own body from the blast of heat. Her face was buried in the wet, sooty fabric of his shirt. His chin was pressed into the top of her hair. He held her. For 1, 2, 3 seconds, the world stopped. There was no thought. There was only the roar of the fire in his ears, the solid, strong, trembling reality of her body pressed against his, and the frantic, hammering pulse of her heart against his chest. He was breathing in the acrid smell of the smoke, the salt sting of his own sweat, and another, sharper scent, the smell of scorched fabric and hair. She was strong. She was not a fragile thing. Her arms were wrapped around his waist, holding on with a desperate, unconscious grip. Their breath was hot, ragged, gasping in each other's space. "Jonah, the wall, it's caught." Hal's voice shattered the moment. The spell broke. Jonah's arms loosened. He didn't release her. He pushed her, hard, back toward the safer zone by the cabin. "Get back the wall." He turned. A tongue of flame had licked up the edge of the tarp and was now climbing the wooden wall of the shed. He grabbed a fresh bucket from the line and threw it, dousing the new flames. The battle was not over. For another hour, they fought. The community, the valley, held the line. They could not save the haystack. It was a total smoking loss. But they saved the shed. They saved the barn. And inside, terrified but safe, Bluebell and Jonah's other cows were alive. As the fire finally sank, exhausted, into a vast, glowing pile of embers, the sky in the east began to turn from black to a bruised, cold purple. Ash was falling like a soft, dark snow, coating everything. The neighbors, one by one, came to him. Their faces were black, their clothes soaked. "This was Dorn. Jonah," Hal Jessup said, his voice flat and hard. "He's gone too far." "We're with you." "Jonah," May Ashford said, pushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "You and your wife, the judge's daughter. You tell us what you need." They nodded, their expressions grim. They gathered their buckets and wagons, and, as quietly as they had come, they melted back into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Jonah and Elowen alone in the smoking, devastated yard. They stood, side by side, watching the last of the embers glow. They were both soaked to the bone. They were covered in mud and soot. They were exhausted. The adrenaline began to drain away, leaving a bone-deep weariness and a cold, shaking dread. Jonah turned to look at her. The first weak light of morning was touching the yard, painting her face in shades of gray and black. He saw what his nose had registered in that brief, frantic moment. A long lock of her thick, brown hair, just above her right temple, was no longer brown. It was a frizzed, blackened, brittle crisp. The fire had touched her. It had licked out and tasted her. He remembered the smell. He remembered the feel of her heart. He lifted his hand. It was black with soot, scraped raw on the bucket handles. He saw it was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. He willed it to be still, but it would not. He reached out. He didn't grab her. He didn't touch her face. He moved with a strange, new gentleness, and with just the tips of his fingers, he touched the ruined strand of hair. He tried to smooth it, to fix it. It just crumbled into ash under his touch. Jonah's voice was not a voice. It was a dry, rasping sound. The thought of what could have happened, of how close she had been, choked him. "Are you all right?" he whispered. The question was so soft it was barely audible, lost in the hiss of the dying embers. It was quieter than a cricket's call. Elowen had flinched when he first moved, expecting a blow or an order, but at his touch, she went very still. She watched him, her eyes wide, glistening in the gray light. He realized she was not crying. Her eyes were just raw and watery from the smoke. She gave a small, jerky nod. He let his hand fall, his fist clenching at his side. They moved, as if by some unspoken agreement, to the porch. They didn't go inside. They collapsed onto the top step, sitting side by side, but not touching. The space between them felt electric. Jonah stared at the smoking ruin of his feed. His entire winter gone. He felt a cold, killing rage settle in his gut. He felt a movement beside him. He turned. Elowen was watching him. She slowly, deliberately, lifted her hand, the one with the needle-pricked fingers, and she placed it, palm flat, on his chest, right over his heart. He started, his head snapping around to look at her. Her hand was steady, but beneath her palm, his heart was still a wild thing. It was pounding, a frantic, galloping rhythm against his ribs. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. She hesitated, then finished, "Husband, for this ranch." Jonah looked down at her hand, so small and smudged against his chest. He slowly raised his own hand and covered hers. He didn't twine his fingers. He didn't grip it. He just laid his hand over hers, a silent, shared acknowledgement. He looked at her face. The soot couldn't hide the exhaustion, the fear. He saw the pact they had made in the dark, the promise of law. He saw the fire. He saw the singed hair. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to kiss the smudge of soot on her cheek, the corner of her smoke-dried lips. He wanted to pull her to him and hold her until the shaking in his own hand stopped. But the pact, only when both are willing. He would not break it. He would not be the man who took. So, instead of lowering his mouth, he leaned forward, slowly. He closed his eyes, and he rested his forehead against hers. Soot to soot, skin to skin. The world stopped again. This time, there was no fire, no panic. There was just the solid, warm reality of her. He could feel her eyelashes, wet from the smoke, flutter against his own gritty cheek. He could feel her breath, warm and steady, on his lips. They just stayed there, breathing each other's air, sharing the same small space, their foreheads pressed together in a vow that was deeper than any kiss. The heat was no longer from the fire. It was a quiet, steady warmth that flowed between them. Elowen was the first to speak. Her voice was a low murmur, vibrating from her brow to his. A small, weary, wondering smile was in her tone. "We have many more nights to lock the door," she whispered. "But from now on, I think it will be by choice." Jonah let out a long, shaky breath he felt he had been holding since he left Cedar Trace. In the far, far distance, from the dark ridges that led back to Copper Vale, a new sound came, faint but sharp in the cold air. The sound of a single horse, galloping hard, moving away. The arsonist, his work done, was riding for home. The sound broke the spell. Jonah pulled back, his jaw tightening. The anger was back, cold and sharp. He looked at Elowen. The cold air was making her shiver, her wet clothes clinging to her. He stood up. He went inside the cabin, to his own room, and came back with a thick, clean blanket from his bed. He wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight. She looked up, her thanks in her eyes. As he turned to sit beside her, she reached up, her fingers finding the collar of his shirt. It was torn and blackened. She tried to straighten it, a simple, absent gesture. Her fingers, calloused and strong, brushed for just 1 second against the hollow of his collarbone. Then, as if realizing what she was doing, she pulled her hand away. Jonah sat beside her. The sun was now a real presence, a bloody red line on the horizon. He stood one more time, his body aching. He walked to the cowshed. He pushed the scorched door open. Bluebell and the other 2 cows were huddled in the back, their eyes wide with terror, but they were unharmed. He grabbed the milk pail. His hands, he noted with some surprise, were perfectly steady. He sat on the stool and milked the heifer, the rhythmic sound a comfort, a return to normalcy. He came back to the porch with the pail, half full of rich, warm milk. He went inside, found their 2 tin cups, and poured, the steam rising in the cold air. He came out and handed 1 cup to her. She took it with both hands, cradling it. They sat on the porch of their damaged, threatened, but surviving ranch. They watched the sun rise over the smoking ruins of their hay. They didn't speak, they just sat, side by side, sipping the warm, sweet milk. The silence was better than words. It was the sound of a partnership being forged, not in law, but in fire. The fire changed everything. The smoking, black ruin of the haystack was a daily, visible reminder of Dorn's malice. But it had an effect he never intended. It had not isolated Jonah and Elowen. It had forged them into a symbol. Neighbors now stopped by Pinyon Bluff daily. They didn't come empty-handed. May Ashford brought a small sack of oats for Bluebell. Hal Jessup and his sons spent a day helping Jonah clear a better fire break around the cabin and barn, their shovels a silent promise of solidarity. They brought food. They brought news. And they brought their own water, refusing to drink from the small, precious stream that trickled from the silt gate. But Silas Dorn was not a man to be beaten by community spirit. He was a snake, and when his rattle failed, he turned to his venom, and to other, quieter snakes. He retreated to Copper Vale and summoned 2 men. The first was Vilas Crane, a private detective from Denver, a small, rat-faced man who wore a city suit and specialized in digging up the past. The second was Kip Rourke, a gunman with a dead-eyed stare and a reputation for finishing jobs that men like Breck Sloan started. Dorn's strategy shifted. The fire had been a mistake. It created martyrs. Now, he would move in the shadows. He gave his orders. Crane was to find anything that could discredit Elowen, or, more importantly, break the 30-day cohabitation clause. Rourke was to watch, to wait, to be the terror in the dark that the boot print had promised. Vilas Crane was good at his job. He did not go near Pinyon Bluff. He went straight to the Mesa Laurel Chapel. He didn't look at the parish log. He looked at the church roof. It was new. The shingles were fresh cedar. He spent an afternoon in the town clerk's office and then at the bank. That evening, he paid a visit to Reverend Tolliver. "A fine roof, Reverend," Crane said, sipping the weak tea Tolliver's wife had offered. "A gift, I'm told, from Mr. Dorn." Reverend Tolliver gripped his cup, his knuckles white. It was a donation. To the Lord's house. "A donation," Crane mused, pulling a small ledger from his pocket, for which the bank holds a note of $200. Co-signed by Mr. Dorn, yes, but with the parish as the primary debtor. And that note is, I see, 30 days past due. Tolliver began to sweat. "The drought. The collections have been poor." "Of course," Crane said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "Mr. Dorn, however, is prepared to be most generous. He is willing to forgive the entire debt. He simply requires a small clarification, a correction, to the parish log." Crane leaned in. "You see, you were under duress. Reverend, that woman, she tricked you. You were confused about the time. It wasn't 6 o'clock, was it?" It was later, and you never saw any bridle lock. You just signed what she told you to. A simple affidavit stating you were mistaken. That's all, mister. Dorn needs to file an injunction and have this whole fantasy thrown out of court." Tolliver looked at the wall, at the framed picture of his small, gray church. He was a weak man, but he was not an evil one. He was trapped. But Elowen Hart Pike was the daughter of the man who wrote the law. She knew how men like Dorn thought. She knew the first point of attack would be the weakest link. "He will go after Tolliver," she said to Jonah that same evening. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the precious map spread between them. "How do you know?" Jonah asked. "Because Tolliver is the only official witness to the two things that matter, the cohabitation and the time." She said, "Dorn's bank holds the note on half the businesses in Copper Vale, and I'd wager my father's ledger that includes the church." She was already writing a letter. "We cannot trust the law in Copper Vale. It belongs to Dorn. We need the law from Garnet Wells." She was writing to Deputy Eamon Lyle. Lyle was a man Jonah had only heard of, a tall, quiet man who had been Judge Hart's personal bailiff and protégé. He was now the ranking lawman in the district, and he operated out of the county seat at Garnet Wells, far from Dorn's influence. "She's asking him to come," Jonah realized. "Will he?" "He will," Elowen said, her voice certain. "He will come because my father's name is on this." She sealed the envelope. "Hal Jessup's boy is riding to the county seat tomorrow. He will take it." While Elowen planned her legal defense, Jonah planned their future. He was no longer just the muscle. He was a partner. He spent hours poring over his wife's map, comparing its red-inked arteries to the land he knew by heart. "Here," he said, his finger tracing a faint line. "Willow Cut. I've walked that gully 100 times. It's bone dry, but your map says there's a seepage line, a secondary channel." "My father believed the aquifer was pressurized," Elowen said, leaning close. "He thought the main dam was just the cap on a bottle. If the pressure was high enough, it would find other ways out." "It's 10 feet down," he wrote. Jonah said, his voice electric with discovery. "He thinks it's 10 feet. Elowen, if we can get a flow here. This is our land. It's not part of the main wash. If we can open this, it's not part of the 30-day agreement. It would be ours." A new hope, sharp and bright, lit between them. It was a promise of a life after the 30 days. But Dorn's other snake was already in the grass. That night, Jonah was asleep on his pallet. Elowen was in the bedroom, but she was not asleep. She was sitting in the dark, reading her father's ledger by the faint moonlight. A sound, a scrape, like a boot on gravel, just outside the bedroom window. She froze. The boot print. This was him. This was Rourke. Her heart hammered, but her mind was ice. He was out there, watching, waiting. For what? To see if Jonah left the cabin to catch them in a lie, to see if she was alone. She didn't panic. She didn't call for Jonah. She thought. She rose, moving silently. She picked up the oil lamp from the dresser. Her hands were perfectly steady. She lit it, the sudden flare of light illuminating the small room. Then she did something clever. She carried the lamp and placed it not on the table, but on the small trunk at the foot of her bed. Directly in front of her was the small, cracked mirror on the washstand. She angled the lamp just so. From outside, in the dark, a man looking in would see only the bright glare of the lamp, blinding him to the interior of the room. But that lamp, reflected in the mirror, would also cast a second, fainter light back toward the window, at an angle. She blew out the match and stood perfectly still, in the shadow beside the door. She waited. 1 minute. 2. Another scrape. Closer. A dark shape blotted out the moonlight in the window. A man's head and shoulders. He was cupping his hands to the glass, trying to see past the glare of the lamp she had set. He leaned in, frustrated, and as he did, his face crossed the angled path of the reflection. For just 1 second, the light from the mirror illuminated his features. It was a gaunt, cruel face, with a long scar on one cheek. Kip Rourke. He saw her, not her, but her shadow, moving in the reflection. He'd been spotted. Jonah Elowin's voice was sharp. Jonah was up, rifle in hand, in a single, fluid motion. He had been sleeping with it ever since the fire. What? The window, Rourke. Jonah didn't hesitate. He didn't run to the window. He ran to the front door, kicked it open, and stepped onto the porch. He lifted the rifle, not to his shoulder, but to his hip. He aimed high, toward the dark, empty sky above the bedroom. He fired. The blast was deafening. It shattered the night, the muzzle flash a brief, violent star. The sound echoed off the mesas like a cannon shot. It was not a shot to kill. It was a shot to announce, we are here. We are armed. We are watching. From the side of the cabin, there was a string of curses, the sound of a man stumbling in the dark, and then the frantic, pounding hoofbeats of a horse riding away at a full gallop. Jonah stood on the porch, the rifle smoking in his hands. Elowin came to stand in the doorway behind him. They listened until the hoofbeats faded to nothing. "He'll be back," Jonah said, his voice grim. "Yes," Elowin said, her hand on his arm, "but he knows we're waiting." Deputy Eamon Lyle arrived 2 days later. He was not what Jonah expected. He was a quiet, thoughtful man, with Judge Hart's eyes and a calm that seemed unshakable. He rode in alone, his badge pinned to his vest, his gun worn low. Elowin met him on the porch. "Mr. Lyle, thank you for coming." "Judge Hart's daughter is in trouble," Lyle said, his voice a soft baritone. He touched the brim of his hat. "I would have come sooner." She explained everything: the charter, the lock, the fire, the man at the window. Lyle listened, his face impassive, nodding slowly. "The fire is ash," he said. "The man is gone. This is all circumstantial. Dorn will deny it." "I know," Elowin said. "That is why I have this." She opened her ledger. She took out the folded linen ribbon, the one with the severed red thread still stitched to it. "Our seal," she said, "from the first night." Lyle looked at it, but Elowin wasn't finished. From her tapestry bag, she produced a small, round tin. She opened it. It was beeswax, mixed with something dark. "My father's ink was purple," she said, "but his sealing wax was black. It was made with pine tar from the North Spur. It has a specific smell when warmed." She held it out. "I sealed the knot of the thread with a single drop. It's a unique mark." Lyle took the ribbon. He saw it. A tiny, dark, glossy bead of wax, holding the knot. He leaned in and sniffed. It smelled of pine and resin. It was a piece of physical evidence a court would have to recognize. "The judge taught you well, ma'am," Lyle said, a flicker of a smile in his eyes. He carefully folded the ribbon and put it in his own pocket. "I will hold this as evidence. In the Garnet Wells lockup." He had barely put it away when they heard the buggy. It was Merritt Vale, and he was not alone. He was accompanied by the Copper Vale sheriff, a burly man named Blevins, who looked like he was already in Dorn's pocket. "Mr. Pike, Mrs." Pike Vale called out, his voice high and nervous. He was holding a piece of paper. "I have here an official injunction from the Copper Vale District Court." "On what grounds?" Elowin asked, stepping forward, with Deputy Lyle a quiet shadow just behind her. "On the grounds of public endangerment," Vale read, "that your diversion of the silt stream is undermining the dam's foundation. You are ordered to cease and desist. The gate is to be closed." He handed the paper to Elowin. Jonah watched her. She didn't read the text. She looked straight at the bottom, at the seal. "A magnifying glass," she said. "What?" Vale squeaked. "Jonah, my sewing kit. The large glass I use for threading." Jonah fetched it. Elowin held the glass over the seal on the paper. Sheriff Blevins shifted, looking uncomfortable. "Deputy Lyle," Elowin said, her voice clear and cutting. "Would you please come and look at this?" Lyle stepped forward. Elowen held the glass steady. "The official seal of the Garnet Wells district," she said, "the one my father designed, uses an ink with a high iron gall content. When it dries, it bites into the paper. Under magnification, you can see the bleed of the edges." She pointed. "This is lampblack. It's sitting on top of the paper, and the typeface for district is a half point too small. This is a forgery, a very, very bad one." Merritt Vale went the color of spoilt milk. "Sheriff Blevins," Deputy Lyle said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of a hammer, "you are attempting to serve a fraudulent document. That is a felony in this district." Blevins' hand, which had been resting on his gun, jumped back. "I was just serving at Merritt here. He's the lawyer I didn't know." "He's lying," Vale shrieked. "Dorn made me do it." "I will be taking this document," Lyle said, plucking it from Elowen's hand, "and I will be taking your statement. Mr. Vale, back in Garnet Wells, you and Sheriff Blevins can ride with me." Merritt Vale looked like he was going to faint. He had been caught, red-handed, by the real law. He began to babble, to make excuses, to blame Dorn. Lyle just motioned him to his horse. The Copper Vale sheriff, his face purple, looked at Lyle, looked at Jonah's rifle, and sullenly complied. As they were mounting up, May Ashford rode into the yard, her face pale with panic. She'd clearly ridden hard from town. "Elo and Jonah," she cried, ignoring the lawmen. "I just heard at the general store. It's Dorn. He's desperate. He's promised Kip Rourke. Oh, Lord, it's shameful." "What is it?" May Elowen asked, her voice calm. "It's his niece," May said, breathless. "Eliza, his brother's girl. She's only 17. She lives with him. He's promised Rourke her hand in marriage if he gets you out of the way. To restore his honor. He's giving that child to that killer." A dead silence fell over the yard. Jonah felt a cold sickness. This went beyond water. This was monstrous. Deputy Lyle, who had been tying Vale's hands, stopped. Elowen's face, which had been calm and victorious, hardened into a mask of cold, pure fury. The judge's fury. She turned, not to May, not to Jonah, but to the deputy. Her voice was not loud. It was terrifyingly quiet. "Deputy Lyle, you will ride to Copper Vale. You will not ride to Garnet Wells. Not yet. You will ride to Silas Dorn's home. You will take that child, Eliza, into your protective custody. As an officer of the district court, you will tell him that she is a minor, and that she is now a ward of your court, pending an investigation into his fitness as a guardian." She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. "I do not care what he does to me. I do not care about this water or this land, not compared to this. You tell him that Elowen Hart Pike said this. We are not in a dirty game. He will not trade children. He will not harm a young girl. This stops. Now." Deputy Lyle stared at her, his respect plain on his face. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at Jonah. "I'll be back for your statements." He turned his horse, and with his 2 humiliated, furious prisoners, he rode hard toward Copper Vale. Jonah and Elowen were left standing in the yard with May Ashford. May was weeping softly. "Oh, Elowen," she said, "to do that for his own family." And in that moment, the fight for the water was over. It had become something else. The word of this, of Elowen's stand, would spread through the valley by nightfall. She had not just fought for their farms. She had fought for their decency. She had protected the innocent, even the innocent of her enemy. The hearts of the valley, which had been trickling toward her like the silt stream, now broke free. The loyalty of the people rushed to her and Jonah, a flood of support, as clean and powerful as the river they were all still waiting for. The preliminary hearing had been held not in a courtroom, but in the neutral territory of the Garnet Wells Town Hall. It was not a trial, but a review of Elowen's petition and Deputy Lyle's evidence. The room had been packed. Dorn was there, his face a mask of controlled fury. his new high-priced lawyer from Denver at his side, but Merritt Vale, facing his own charges, had turned. He had provided a sworn statement detailing the forgery of the court order. Deputy Lyle had presented the fraudulent document, the forged seal damningly different from the real one he'd brought from the county vault. But the most powerful moment had been Elowen's own testimony. She had presented her father's ledger. She had presented the linen ribbon with the severed red thread and the unique pine tar wax seal. And she had spoken of Eliza, Dorn's 17-year-old niece. She had calmly, clearly stated that Dorn's attempt to trade a minor for an act of violence proved his fundamental unfitness, not just as a guardian, but as a steward of any public trust. The judge, a stern, circuit-riding woman named Eulalie North, had listened without expression. Her ruling was swift and sharp. The forged injunction was struck. The 30-day probationary period would stand. A full investigation into Dorn's original claim, his forged seal, and his treatment of his niece was to be opened immediately. It was not a final victory, but it was a resounding one. They had won the right to continue the fight. The ride back to Pinyon Bluff was long. The sun had set, and the desert was bathed in a profound silver light. A great heavy moon, a 14th moon, swollen and bright, hung low in the sky, making the skeletal Ocotillo cast sharp, black shadows. This time, the silence in the wagon was not the cold, crushing weight of their first ride. It was a shared, humming quiet. The silence of soldiers after a battle won, a silence full of things unsaid. Jonah held the reins, his eyes on the road, but he was aware of her in a way that was entirely new. He was aware of the space she took up on the bench, the way the moonlight caught the silver in her plain brown hair, the steady rhythm of her breathing. They had faced law and fire and the threat of violence, and they were still here. When they crested the rise to Pinyon Bluff, the cabin looked different. It was no longer the graveyard he had returned to that first night. The small, muddy pool at the end of the ditch gleamed in the moonlight. The rust on the roof looked less like blood and more like the rich, red earth. It was a scar, not a wound. He pulled the wagon to a stop. Bluebell lowed a soft greeting from the shed. Jonah set the brake and sat for a moment, the reins slack in his hands. "We're home," he said. It was the first time he had called it that in her presence. Elowen nodded, her hands clasped in her lap. Jonah climbed down and came around to her side of the wagon. He offered his hand. It was a simple gesture, the kind any man might offer a woman. But for them, it was freighted with meaning. She looked at his hand calloused, scarred, the one that had held hers over his heart and then placed her own in it. He helped her down. Her hand was not small, not delicate. It was strong. It was real. He did not let go immediately. Their eyes met in the silver light. "It was a good day, Jonah," she said. "It was, Elowen," he replied. They stood like that for a long moment, their hands linked, the silence of the high desert wrapping around them. Then, reluctantly, he released her. He tended to the horse, and she went to check on Bluebell, their chores a familiar, comforting dance. Later, they stood on the porch, the cabin door looming behind them. This was the moment, the night. He would go to his pallet. She would go to the bedroom. It was the new, unspoken routine. But Elowen did not move toward the door. She stood by the porch rail, looking out at the moonlit land. She turned to him. Her face was half in shadow, half in light. "The first night," she said, her voice low and steady, "I locked that door for the law, to fulfill my father's words." Jonah watched her, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. "Tonight," she continued, "if that door is locked, it will be for us." She reached into the deep pocket of her skirt. Her hand emerged, and in her palm, glinting in the moonlight, was the old, heavy iron key to the bedroom. She held it out to him. It was a question. It was a statement. It was a yielding of all the power she had fought so hard to win. She was giving him the key. She was giving him the choice. Jonah looked at the key. He looked at her face, her calm, brave, open face. He saw the firelight on her skin, the singed patch of her hair. He saw the woman who had faced down Dorn, who had saved a child she didn't even know. He felt a wave of something, a tenderness so fierce it almost hurt. He had married her for a cow. He would, he realized, tear down a mountain for her. He slowly reached out, but he did not take the key. Instead, he placed his hand under hers, his fingers curling around her hand, closing it, so that the key was pressed into her own palm. He held her fist, with the key inside it, and looked her in the eyes. "You decide, Elowen," he said, his voice Hupenars. "It's always your decision." He was giving the power right back to her. The key, the lock, the room. It was hers to command. A slow, small smile touched her lips. It was a smile of such profound understanding that it made his chest ache. She nodded. A single, small movement. She turned, her hand still holding the key. She walked to the cabin door. He followed. She stepped inside, into the main room. He stepped in after her and pulled the main door shut, closing out the cold night air. Elowen walked to the bedroom door. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The sound of the bolt sliding home, that click that had started everything, was loud in the small cabin. She had locked the door, for them. She left the key in the lock and turned to face him. He lit the lamp on the main table, and then the one on the dresser inside the bedroom. The small room was instantly transformed. The lamplight was not the harsh, interrogating light of their first night, or the frantic, orange glare of the fire. It was a deep, warm, liquid gold. It pooled on the worn quilt and softened the rough log walls. It felt as warm as honey. They stood, just inside the room, facing each other. The air was thick with the unsaid. She slowly, deliberately, unpinned her heavy shawl from her shoulders. She folded it and laid it on the chair. Jonah watched her hands, those capable, strong hands. He mirrored her. He pulled off his worn leather work gloves, which he had tucked into his belt, and set them on the washstand. It was a shedding of their armor, a removal of the day's and the world's hard edges. They stood a few feet apart, close enough to hear the soft sound of each other's breathing, close enough to see the way the lamplight reflected in her eyes. "Elowen," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He took one step. He was in her space now. He could smell the faint, clean scent of lye soap that always clung to her, and the smell of the wood smoke from the cabin. He lifted his hand, the one that had trembled after the fire. It was steady now. He didn't touch her face. He touched her hair, just behind her ear, where it was soft and unharmed. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She closed her eyes, just for a second, and leaned her head into his touch. It was a surrender. It was a yes. He let his hand slide down, to her shoulder, to her waist. He put his other hand on her hip. The prompt from their first night had been about her weight, and he felt it now. She was a solid, strong, real woman. He was not pulling her to him. He was grounding himself on her. He was holding her, supporting her, a silent promise that he was there, that she was cherished, that she was safe. She looked up at him. He lowered his head, slowly. He was giving her time to turn away. She did not turn away. She rose on her toes, just slightly, to meet him. The first kiss was not a kiss at all. It was a touch, the brush of his lips against hers. It was a question, hesitant and dry. "Is this all right?" She answered, not with words, but with a small, soft sound in her throat. She shifted in his arms, and her hand, which had been at her side, came up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was the only answer he needed. He kissed her. It was not a desperate, frantic kiss. It was slow. It was deep. It was a kiss of discovery, of gratitude, of a thirst he hadn't known he had. It was the taste of coffee and smoke and Elowen. It was the end of a long, long drought. When he finally, reluctantly, drew back, they were both breathless. Elowen didn't open her eyes. She let her head fall forward, resting her forehead against the warm, solid column of his throat. He could feel her breath, hot and shaky, on his skin. He held her, his arms wrapped tight around her, his own heart pounding a rhythm that matched hers. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I'm here," he said. He felt her mouth move against his skin, a small, secret smile. This button, it's digging into my chin." He looked down, the top button of his rough work shirt, a stubborn piece of carved bone, was indeed pressing into her face. He fumbled with it, his fingers suddenly thick and clumsy. She laughed, a low, breathy chuckle that vibrated through his entire body. It was the most intimate sound he had ever heard. "Here," she said, tilting her head back. She brushed his clumsy hands aside and, with her own deft, needlework fingers, she undid the button, and the next one. She didn't push the shirt aside. She just rested her head back against his collarbone, in the hollow she had made. "That's better," she murmured. They stood like that, in the honey-warm light, just holding each other. The silence was full. "Jonah," she said, her voice small. I don't know." He understood. She was strong. She was brave. But this was new. He was, in every way that mattered, her first. He tightened his grip. "It's all right. We don't have to do anything. We can just stand here." She tilted her head to look up at him. Her eyes were dark in the lamplight. "No," she said. I like it when you look at me. When you look at me straight on. Like you are now. I like your hands. They're strong." She took his hand from her hip and laced her fingers with his, examining their joined hands. "And I like slow." His heart felt like it would burst. She was not just accepting this. She was directing it. She was stating her terms, just as she had on the first night. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her calloused knuckles. "Slow," he agreed, his voice thick. "Slow is good." He led her to the bed. They sat on the edge, on the worn quilt. They didn't fall onto it. They sat, their sides pressed together, their hands still linked. "I was thinking today," he said, his voice quiet, "about that patch of land, up past Willowcut." She turned to him, her eyes brightening, pulled into the safety of their shared future, the secondary channel. "I was thinking," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, "that it's a good place. It's sheltered from the wind. We could build a real house there, someday, one with a deep porch, a porch wide enough to sit on during a rainstorm." "The smell of rain on dry dirt," she whispered, a small, wistful smile on her face. "My father loved that. He called it petrichor." "We'll have that," Jonah promised. "And I've been reading in that cattleman's journal Hal lent me, about a breed, sugar-top reds. They're meant to be good mothers, gentle. They give rich milk." "Sugar-top reds," she repeated, tasting the name. "I like that. A whole herd, not just Bluebell." "A whole herd," he agreed. He leaned in and kissed her again, a slow, soft kiss on her temple, near the singed hair. She turned her head, and their mouths found each other again, this time with less questioning and more certainty. He eased her back onto the bed, his arm supporting her. He lay down beside her, on top of the quilt, his boots still on, his shirt still mostly buttoned. She lay facing him, her hand on his chest. They talked. They whispered in the warm light, their faces close. They talked about the land, about the water, about the look on Dorn's face. They talked about the future, a thing neither of them had dared to own until now. His hand stroked her hair. Her fingers idly traced the buttons on his shirt. The touches were warm and constant, but they were discreet. They were the touches of two people learning each other, mapping each other just as they had mapped the valley. It was all respect. It was all consent. There was no crudeness. There was no spectacle. It was just two strong, scarred people, finding a home in each other. The lamp on the dresser began to gutter, the oil running low. Jonah reached out, his arm brushing her. He turned the small metal wheel. The flame died, plunging the room into a soft, moonlit dark. There was only the sound of the wind whistling low around the cabin eaves, and the sound of two hearts beating in the quiet. Beating, at last, as one. The next morning, Jonah woke first. The light in the room was gray and cold. He was on his pallet in the main room. He didn't remember moving. He must have, at some point, given her the bed, given her the space. He heard a movement from the bedroom. The door opened. Elowen stood there, her hair down, her feet bare. She was wrapped in the quilt from the bed, her face soft with sleep. She looked at him, and a slow, warm smile spread across her face. A smile he had never seen before, a smile of pure, unguarded happiness. He smiled back, his heart full. She looked at the bedroom door, at the key still in the lock. Then she looked at him. "Well," she said, her voice husky with sleep, "I suppose we won't be needing the red thread anymore." The 30-day probationary period was a flurry of activity. Jonah, with Hal Jessup and other neighbors, worked from sunup to sundown at Willow Cut. They were not just digging. They were timbering a shaft, like miners, chasing the promise of water on Elowen's map. Every time Jonah's pick struck damp earth, a cheer went up. Elowen, meanwhile, worked with Deputy Lyle. They rode to Garnet Wells, spending days in the dusty, archive-smelling vault of the courthouse, poring over Judge Hart's old rulings, building their case. The 30 days were not just a test of water. They were a countdown to the legal battle of their lives. The day of the hearing arrived, bright and cold. Judge Eulalie North, true to her reputation as a circuit judge, had agreed to hear the petition in Copper Vale to accommodate the number of local witnesses, but she refused to sit in Dorn's pocket by using the bank or the chapel. The hearing was convened in the Granary Hall. It was a vast, cavernous building, smelling of milled flour, burlap, and dry dust. There was no furniture, save for a long shipping table and 3 chairs that had been set up on the loading dock for Judge North and her clerks. The townspeople, the entire valley. It seemed packed the space. They sat on sacks of grain, on wagon wheels, on the floor. It was a court of the people, in the truest sense. Jonah and Elowen sat in the front, on a bench May Ashford had saved for them. Behind them was a solid wall of their neighbors, Hal Jessup, May, the Greer brothers, Old Man Hemlock. They were there as witnesses. They were there as a community. On the other side, Silas Dorn sat with his new slick-looking lawyer from Denver. His section was conspicuously empty, save for a few nervous-looking businessmen from the town, and, in the very back, leaning against a support beam, Kip Rourke. He was just watching, his hand resting on his hip. Judge North, a woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing, banged a wooden gavel on the table. "This court is in session," she declared, her voice ringing through the hall. "This is a hearing on the petition of Elowen Hart Pike regarding the water rights of the Sage Notch Dam, currently under the stewardship of Mr. Silas Dorn, and the counter-petition of Mr. Dorn, alleging fraud." Dorn's lawyer, a man named Folsom, stood up. He was smooth. He was polished. He argued that Elowen was a fraud, an imposter, that her claim was based on an archaic, symbolic clause, that her cohabitation was a sham, a conspiracy with a bankrupt rancher to steal private property. He accused Jonah of coercion, of marrying Elowen purely to gain access to the water. "It is a clear case of conspiracy and deceit, Your Honor, Folsom concluded, smiling at the crowd as if the matter were already settled. Judge North just stared at him. Thank you, Mr. Folsom, Mrs. Pike. Elowen stood. She did not look at Folsom. She looked at the judge. She wore her simple brown dress, the one she had been married in. Your Honor, Elowen began, her voice clear and steady. We are not here to debate my father's laws. They are on the books. We are here to prove they were followed. We are also here to countersue Mr. Dorn on 2 counts first, for the filing of a fraudulent court document with a forged seal, and second, for the deliberate, malicious, and long-term misappropriation of a public trust, the water of the Thunder Wash. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not just a defense. This was an attack. We will begin with the forgery. Elowen said, I would like to call Mr. Merritt Vale to the stand. Merritt Vale looked like a ghost. He was pale, his hands shaking as he took the oath. He had made a deal with Deputy Lyle. He was testifying in exchange for lesser charges. Mr. Vale, Elowen said, you were Mr. Dorn's lawyer. Did you, on his orders, create a false injunction to be served at Pinyon Bluff? Vale swallowed. Yes, he told me to. And the seal of the court, where did you get it? We had one made in Denver, Vale whispered. It was an embosser, to press into the paper, to make it look official. Mr. Folsom, Judge North cut in, her voice sharp. Your client is accused of forging the seal of this very court. Do you have a response? Folsom leaped to his feet. My client denies this. This is the word of a desperate, disbarred man, trying to save his own skin, Mr. Vale has no proof. But I do. Your Honor, Elowen said. Mr. Vale, you brought the forgery tool with you, as requested by Deputy Lyle. Please present it. Vale, his hands shaking, produced the small, metal embosser from his satchel. He handed it to Judge North, who examined it with disgust. A clever toy, Mr. Folsom, the judge said. But not proof he ever used it, Folsom argued. No, sir, it is not, Elowen agreed. But this is, Your Honor, the ink my father designed for the Garnet Wells court. The purple ink he sealed his charters with is not common ink. It is an iron gall mix, steeped with oak galls and copperas. It is a living ink. It changes. The forgery is just dye. She turned to Deputy Lyle. Deputy, you have the materials I requested. Lyle nodded. He brought forward 2 items, a small jar of dark liquid and a tin of lampblack. This, Elowen said, holding up the jar, is simple tannin from a leather tanner's shop. And this, lampblack, Mr. Folsom, your client's forged embosser is useless without ink, and the ink they used was a cheap lampblack mix. My father's ink behaves differently. She addressed the judge. Your Honor, I request a simple test, a single drop of tannin on the ink of my father's true charter, and a single drop on the ink of Mr. Dorn's forged bank documents, the ones he used to seize my land. The entire hall held its breath. This was frontier science. This was a magic trick. Judge North nodded. Proceed, Mrs. Pike. Elowen first presented her father's ledger, open to the page with his purple, sealed signature. With a steady hand, she used a dropper to place 1 drop of tannin on the corner of the signature. The purple ink, where the tannin touched it, instantly turned a deep, dark, rich black, a chemical reaction. The iron in the ink, Elowen explained, reacts with the acid. It turns black. A gasp went through the room. Now, she said, taking the forged deed to the Sage Notch Dam, the one Dorn had built his empire on. She placed a single drop of tannin on Dorn's signature. Nothing happened. The ink stayed a dull, flat purple. It was dye. It was dead. It is a forgery, Elowen said, her voice ringing. The entire foundation of Mr. Dorn's wealth, that dam, that land, It is all built on this, a lie. Silas Dorn was on his feet, his face purple. This is a trick, a witch's trick. She is a charlatan. Sit down, Mr. Dorn, Judge North commanded. Banging her gavel. The evidence is noted, profoundly noted. Dorn's lawyer, Folsom, was white. His entire case had just evaporated. Now, Elowen said, turning, to the matter of the cohabitation. I call Reverend Tolliver. The Reverend walked to the stand, his face a mask of shame. He took the oath. Elowen was gentle. Reverend, did you, on the night of my marriage, fulfill your duty to witness the start of cohabitation? Tolliver nodded, his eyes on the floor. I did, at 6 a.m, as the bell chimed. And were you aware of the Hart Charter, of the bridal lock provision? Folsom was on his feet. Objection, he is not a legal scholar. He was my father's student, Mr. Folsom. He is a sworn officer of this court. Please, Reverend, answer the question. Tolliver took a deep breath. Yes, I knew of it. It was an eccentric, but binding, oath. And Mrs. Pike, she told me it had been fulfilled. And yet, Elowen said, her voice soft, you later considered changing your testimony. Why? Tolliver looked at Dorn. His gaze was no longer fearful. It was angry. Because Mr. Dorn, through his agent Vilas Crane, reminded me that I owed the bank $200 for my church roof. He offered to forgive the debt if I would perjure myself, if I would lie. The crowd erupted. Shame, someone yelled from the back. That is all. Reverend, thank you for your honesty. Elowen then called May Ashford. May testified to the fire. She testified to the boot print. She testified to the terror that Dorn's men, Breck Sloan and Kip Rourke, had brought to the valley. She called Hal Jessup. Hal testified to the change the water had brought. Your Honor, he said, his voice thick with emotion, that little stream, it saved my spring wheat. It gave my cattle enough for the first time in 7 years. My children aren't thirsty. That water, it belongs to us all, not to him. He pointed at Dorn. Then, Elowen said, I call my husband, Jonah Pike. Jonah took the stand. He was not a talker. He was not a lawyer. He just held the map. Your Honor, Jonah said, his voice rough but clear. My wife has spoken of the law. I want to speak of the land. This is her father's map. It shows the water under the ground. For 7 years. Dorn has told us there is a drought, but the water has been there. He's just been sitting on it. He unrolled the map and showed the judge. And this is Willow Cut. It's on my land. My neighbors and I. We've been digging. We're 10 feet down. The earth is mud. It's not a trickle. Your Honor, it's a river. It's waiting. If the dam is opened right, this whole valley can be self-sufficient. He hasn't just been hoarding the water. He's been choking the source. Jonah's testimony was the practical, physical proof of Dorn's greed. Silas Dorn could not take it. He leaped to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage, his control shattered. Lies, all of it. It's my water, I own it, and when this farce is over, I will lock that dam forever. You will all come begging to me. You will thirst. The hall went dead silent. Dorn had just confessed. In front of a judge and the entire valley, he had confessed his intent to abuse his power. Judge North just stared at him, her pen held motionless over her paper. Thank you, Mr. Dorn, she said, her voice dripping ice. Your passionate defense is noted for the record as a clear statement of abusive intent. Please, sit down. Dorn, realizing what he had done, collapsed into his chair, his face ashen. His lawyer, Folsom, didn't even look at him. Mrs. Pike, the judge said, do you have anything further? Elowen stood. She was not holding her ledger. She was holding a single, folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. Only this, Your Honor, she said, a final letter, from my father, Judge Alistair Hart. It was found in his desk. It is not a legal document. It is a letter to whomever would come after him. His moral will. She unfolded it. Her hands were steady, but her voice, for the first time, was thick with an emotion that vibrated through the silent hall. To the future steward of the Thunder Wash, she read, I leave this charge. Water is not a commodity. It is not a thing to be owned, no more than the air or the sun. It is a covenant. It is the blood of the land and the right of the people. To hoard it is to steal the future. To choke it is to murder the community. I have written laws, but laws are only as good as the men who keep them. I leave this water not to the strongest or the richest, but to the commons, to be shared with equity, with fairness, and with an eye toward God. Do not fail this trust. She folded the letter. A tear, one single, hot tear, escaped and ran down her cheek, leaving a clean track in the dust. She did not wipe it. Silas Dorn, she said, her voice clear, has failed this trust. She sat down. The silence was absolute. Judge Eulalie North looked at the crowd. She looked at Dorn. She looked at Elowin and Jonah. She banged her gavel. Once. This court is not blind, Mr. Folsom, nor is it deaf. The evidence presented today is overwhelming. She took a breath. It is the ruling of this court, on a temporary basis, that the stewardship of the Sage Notch Dam is hereby revoked from Mr. Silas Dorn, effective immediately. A roar went up from the crowd. Quiet, the judge yelled. Control of the dam and its mechanisms will be turned over to a community committee, to be chaired by Deputy Eamon Lyle, for a period of 60 days. Furthermore, she continued, I am ordering a full and binding investigation by the District Attorney's Office into the fraudulent seal and the original forged deed. I am ordering that all of Mr. Dorn's business ledgers, bank books, and personal notes be seized, immediately, to be audited for this investigation. Dorn was a statue, his face gray. He had lost. Finally, the judge said, the care of the minor, Eliza Dorn, is hereby remanded to the custody of this court, pending a full investigation of guardianship. This hearing is adjourned. It was chaos. People were cheering, crying. May Ashford was hugging Elowin. Hal Jessup was pounding Jonah on the back. In the midst of the celebration, no one was watching Silas Dorn. He sat frozen in his chair, his world in ruins. Folsom, his lawyer, was already packing his briefcase. Abandoning his client, Dorn turned, his eyes scanning the back of the room. He found his target. Kip Rourke had not moved. He was still watching, his face impassive. Dorn was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a man who escalated. He saw Jonah and Elowin, surrounded by their friends, vulnerable in their victory. He rose, unnoticed, and walked toward the back exit, passing Rourke in the shadows of the doorway. As he passed, he leaned in, his voice a low, venomous whisper, lost in the noise of the crowd. "The girl," he hissed. "Take the girl. Take her tonight. Pinyon Bluff. Bring her to me. If I can't have the water, he can't have her." Rourke's lips barely moved. A small, cold smile touched his face. He nodded once, a tiny, deadly acknowledgement. But someone else had seen. Someone else was standing in the shadows. Deputy Eamon Lyle, his duty to the crowd finished, had been watching Dorn. He had seen the man's desperate, furious gaze. He had seen him move. He had seen the whisper. He was too far away to hear the words, but he knew the men. He knew Dorn's desperation. He knew Rourke's trade. As Dorn slipped out the back door and Rourke melted into the dispersing crowd, Deputy Lyle did not join the celebration. He touched the brim of his hat to Elowin, a silent congratulation. Then, his face grim, he slipped out the side door, his hand on his gun. He would not be riding to Garnet Wells. He would be riding, discreetly, back to Pinyon Bluff. The legal fight was over. The real one was about to begin. The celebration in the granary hall was short-lived. A victory in court was not a victory on the land. As Jonah and Elowin led the neighbors out into the late afternoon sun, the sky had changed. The flat white heat of the drought had broken, but not in a gentle way. To the north, over the high peaks of the North Spur, the clouds were not white, but a deep, bruised, greenish purple. The air had become heavy, humid, and still. Elowin stopped on the steps, her hand on Jonah's arm. She sniffed the air. "What is it?" Jonah asked, his eyes on the crowd. "That wind," she whispered, "from the North Spur. My father, he had a name for it. He called it a gully washer. It's not a healing rain. Jonah, it's a flood." A cold dread settled over him. A flash flood, hitting the dam, with the pressure already high. "Dorn knows it too," she said, her voice grim. "He's not a rancher, but he's the opportunist. He knows this weather." Jonah looked at her, the pieces clicking into place. He's not just going to let the committee take over. He'll blame the flood. He'll say our tampering broke the dam. He won't just let it break. "Jonah," Elowin said, her eyes wide with a terrible understanding. "He'll make it break. He and Rourke, they'll go up there tonight, in the storm. They'll jam the spillway, lock the gate. They'll try to build the pressure so high the dam wall fails. They will destroy the whole valley just to prove he was right, to blame us." The first fat, heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dust with audible thumps. Hal Jonah roared, "May, everybody get your wagons, get your ropes. We have to ride. He's going to the dam. He's going to break the dam." Panic rippled through the crowd. But before it could take root, Elowin raised her voice. "No, not in chaos, Hal. Take 3 men and ride to the chapel. Ring the bell, ring it, like there's a fire. That's the signal, Jonah. You and the Greer brothers. Get the longest ropes you can find, and lanterns meet at the dam road." She was a commander. She was Judge Hart's daughter. The crowd, which had been a mob, became an army. Jonah grabbed her arm. "Where will you be?" "I'm going with you," she said, her jaw set. "My father had rescue manuals. He wrote about dam failures. I know what to do with those ropes." The night was a nightmare. The sky tore open. The rain was not rain. It was a solid, falling wall of water. It turned the dusty roads into running rivers of mud. The wind howled down from the North Spur, screaming like a living thing. Through it all, 2 sounds cut the air, the frantic, desperate clanging of the Mesa Laurel Chapel bell and the roar of the Thunder Wash, a river that had been dry for 7 years, now filling with a terrifying, muddy rage. They reached the Sage Notch Dam in a torrent. The crowd of ranchers, maybe 20 strong, arrived with torches and lanterns. The light was chaotic, reflecting off the sheets of rain. The dam itself was groaning, a deep, timber-shuddering sound as the lake behind it swelled. And on top of the dam wall, illuminated against the black sky, were 2 figures, Dorn and Kip Rourke. They weren't trying to open the gate. They were trying to lock it. They had a massive iron chain and were trying to loop it around the main wheel, to jam the mechanism, to stop the new committee from ever being able to release the pressure. Dorn Jonah roared, his voice barely audible over the storm. Dorn looked up, his face a mask of hellish fury in the torchlight. "You're too late. Pike, it's all going, and they'll blame you. They'll blame the witch who tampered with my dam." "Jonah, the ropes!" Elowin shouted. She was already organizing the men, forcing them to tie the safety lines she'd read about, anchoring them to the solid bedrock on the shore. No one goes on that wall without a line. The spillway is too fast. Jonah grabbed a rope, tied it around his waist, and started up the slick timber steps to the top of the dam. Hal Jessup right behind him. Rourke Dorn shrieked, "Stop him!" Kip Rourke let go of the chain. He was fast. He pulled his revolver. The rain was so heavy the gun was soaked, but he was close. "This ends now!" Pike Rourke yelled. Jonah was unarmed. He didn't have time to stop. He did the only thing he could. He lowered his shoulder and charged. He hit Rourke like a bull. It was a tackle, pure desperation and weight. They collided, their boots skidding on the slick, treacherous timber of the dam wall. Rourke's finger, already on the trigger, clenched. The gun fired. The sound was shockingly loud, a flat crack against the roar of the water. Rourke screamed. Jonah thought he'd been shot, but Rourke was staring at his hand. Jonah hadn't been hit. The gun, slippery with rain, had bucked in Rourke's hand, and the bullet had gone wild. It hadn't hit Jonah. It hadn't hit Rourke. The bullet, fired at point-blank range, had struck the heavy iron chain that Dorn was trying to wrap around the wheel. It struck a single, taut link. The link shattered. The chain snapped with the sound of a cannon shot. The main wheel, which had been under the unimaginable, building pressure of the floodwaters, was suddenly free. With a scream of tortured metal, the wheel spun, the gate mechanism engaged. The main spillway, which Dorn had been trying to lock, tore open. It was not a disaster. It was a release. A wall of water, a solid, thundering column of it, burst from the spillway. It was not a dam break. It was the dam working, releasing the pressure exactly as it was designed to do. The water, held back for 7 long years, shot out into the main channel. It was a glorious, terrifying sight. A herd of silver horses galloping down the valley in the torchlight, free at last. A cheer went up from the ranchers, safe on the bank, held by Elowin's ropes. But on the dam, it was chaos. The backlash from the released chain had whipped Dorn, sending him staggering. He lost his footing on the slick wood. "No!" he shrieked, his arms windmilling. He fell. He didn't fall into the lake. He didn't fall into the main spillway. He slipped down the side of the dam wall, sliding on the mossy timbers, and managed to grab onto a wooden support beam just above the churning, violent water. He was dangling, his legs kicking, the torrent just inches beneath his boots. Rourke, seeing his gun was useless and his boss was lost, scrambled away into the darkness, a coward to the last. Jonah and Hal crept to the edge. They looked down at Dorn. He was hanging, his face white with terror. "Jonah, please!" he screamed. "Don't let me help me!" Jonah looked at the man who had tried to starve him, the man who had tried to burn his wife, the man who had just tried to destroy the entire valley. He could just walk away. No one would blame him. He looked back. Elowin was there. She had run up the steps, her own safety line in her hand. Her eyes met Jonah's. They didn't need to speak. They had saved their enemy in the courthouse. They would save him here, in the storm. They were not him. "Throw it!" Jonah yelled. Elowin, with a strong, practiced arm, threw the coiled rope. It unspooled, and the loop at the end landed perfectly, right in front of Dorn's face. He grabbed it with a desperate sob. "Pull!" Jonah roared. He grabbed the rope, bracing his boots against the timber. Hal Jessup grabbed on behind him. The ranchers on the shore, seeing what was happening, formed a chain, holding the anchor line. With Dorn screaming and the valley watching, Jonah Pike and Elowin Hart hauled their enemy, sputtering and sobbing. From the edge of the abyss, they dragged him onto the top of the dam like a drowned rat. "It's over, Silas," Jonah said, his voice flat, exhausted. And as if on cue, 2 figures stepped out of the rain, their rifles steady. It was Deputy Eamon Lyle, and behind him, wrapped in an oilskin slicker, Judge Eulalie North. "I saw the whole thing." "Silas," Lyle said, his voice calm, cutting through the storm. "From the ridge, I've been following you since you left the hall. I saw you and Rourke try to jam that wheel. I saw you try to murder this valley, and I saw them save your life." Lyle walked past him, to Dorn's saddlebag, which was still on his horse. He reached inside and pulled out the small, metal embosser, the forgery tool. "I believe this is evidence in a district case," he said, Silas Dorn, you are under arrest for conspiracy, for attempted destruction of public property, and for the attempted murder of every soul in this valley." The next day, the emergency court was reconvened. The rain had passed. The sun was shining on a valley that was muddy, soaked, but blessedly alive. Merritt Vale, seeing Dorn in chains, told the court everything. He confessed to a decade of forgeries, of intimidation, all on Dorn's orders. The judgment was final. Judge North stripped Silas Dorn of everything: his land, his bank shares, his forged deeds. They were all seized by the district. He and Kip Rourke, who was found hiding in a cellar in town, were sentenced to the territorial prison in Yuma. And the court, in its final act, officially dissolved Dorn's ownership of the dam and established the Thunder Wash Water Cooperative, its board of directors to be elected by the landowners. Their first act was to elect Elowyn Hart Pike as the chair. She stood before them, in the granary hall, holding her father's original, purple-inked Charter 18. "This does not belong to me," she said, her voice full of emotion. "It does not belong in a vault, or in a single person's hands." She walked over and handed the priceless, ancient document to Hal Jessup, the newly elected co-op manager. "It belongs to the valley," she said. "It belongs to the commons. Water belongs to those who need it most." That evening, they stood on the porch of Pinyon Bluff. The air was cool, and it carried a smell Jonah had only dreamed of: the rich, deep, loamy scent of wet earth, petrichor. The little silt stream was no longer a trickle. It was a healthy, happy creek, gurgling in the twilight. Down in the shed, Bluebell was safe, and they could hear the faint, new cry of her calf, born during the storm. Jonah was sitting on the step, whittling a piece of wood. He was sketching, in the damp earth, the plan for a new, wide porch, one wide enough to sit on and watch the rain. Elowyn came and sat beside him. She was quiet. She held something in her hand. It was the old, heavy iron key, the one from the first night. She had tied it to a simple leather thong. "The first night," she said softly. "This was a lock against fear, to keep you out." He watched her, his hands still. "Then," she continued, "it was a lock of trust, to let you in." She lifted the thong and settled it around her neck. The key, dark and heavy, rested on her collarbone. "Now," she whispered, "it's a lock to keep what is precious, to remind me." Jonah put his arm around her. He pulled her close. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand covering his on her waist. He didn't kiss her lips. He leaned down and pressed a long, slow, grateful kiss to the crown of her head, to the place where the fire had singed her hair. From the road, they heard a sound. It wasn't a threat. It was laughter. May Ashford's wagon was passing, and her 2 young children, under her watchful eye, were running gleefully through the muddy puddles, their shouts echoing in the clean, safe air. Life was returning. The valley was safe. The children were safe. Jonah held his wife tighter. "We'll tell our children. Elowyn," he whispered, his voice thick, "and our grandchildren. We'll tell them about the night the water came back to the valley." She tilted her head, looking up at him, her eyes full of the new, wet moonlight. "And the night," she finished, her hand over his heart, "that our hearts came back to each other." Thank you so much for listening to our story. Where are you listening from today? Let us know in the comments so we can share our thoughts and connect. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. And if you'd like to support us further, please press that hype button to help this story be heard by even more people.